Welcome, friends. Tonight we drift into the dimly lit corridors of Tudor history, where silence hangs heavy over a king's final hours. By candlelight and quiet, we'll walk beside Henry VIII, England's most notorious monarch, not at the height of his power, but in the long, lingering twilight of his reign. Gone are the courtly masques and royal feasts. What remains is a broken man, consumed by pain, haunted by legacy, and, perhaps, by secrets never written into the official scrolls of history. This is not the Henry you know from portraits and power plays. This is the Henry history prefers to whisper about, if it speaks of him at all. His swollen leg, the festering wound, the collapse of his once mighty frame, and the strange rituals and political maneuverings that surrounded his deathbed. What was it like in those final weeks of 1547? Who was allowed into the chamber and who was kept out? What were his last words, and were they his own? Tonight we won't shout these questions into the dark. We'll whisper them gently, as if reading from a forbidden journal long forgotten in the royal archives. Let the rain fall softly on the stone walls of Whitehall Palace, and let the flicker of firelight lull you into a gentler, slower world. A world of secrets, shadows, and slow decay. So settle into bed, breathe deeply, and prepare for the end of a king, the kind that history books skim past, but dreams refuse to forget. Let's begin. The king's decline begins. The story of a king's end rarely begins with a single dramatic event. It is not a sudden storm, but a slow, creeping fog. For Henry VIII, the year 1546 was the year the fog truly began to roll in, thick and suffocating, obscuring the vibrant, formidable man he once was. The great oak of the Tudor dynasty, which had stood so defiantly against the winds of Rome and the ambitions of Europe, was beginning to rot from within. To understand the king's final days, we must first understand the prison his own body had become. In the quiet, overheated chambers of Whitehall Palace, the air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke, spiced wine, and something else, something faintly sweet and foul. It was the scent of sickness, a smell that clung to the heavy velvet curtains and the intricate tapestries depicting heroic hunts and ancient battles, scenes of a vitality the king himself could no longer dream of. Henry, once the epitome of Renaissance princedom, the golden youth who could joust, dance, hunt, and compose music with equal skill, was now a monumental ruin of a man. His decline was not just a matter of age. He was only in his mid-50s. It was a catastrophic collapse, a slow-motion dismantling of a titan. The most immediate and visible aspect of his decline was his immense size. In his youth, he was a fine athlete, with a powerful build and a 32-inch waist. By 1546, his waist had swelled to a staggering 54 inches. His suits of armor, once symbols of his martial prowess, now served as metallic records of his physical decay, each new suit wider and heavier than the last. He was morbidly obese, weighing close to 400 pounds, a prisoner of his own flesh. Moving this colossal weight was a Herculean task, not for him, but for his servants. He could no longer manage stairs. Instead, he was moved from floor to floor by a device akin to a modern stair lift, a wooden chair hauled by servants using a system of ropes and pulleys.
To get him onto his horse, a special crane-like contraption was required. The image is almost tragic-comic. The supreme head of the Church of England, the fearsome monarch who had brought down queens and cardinals, being hoisted about his own palace like a piece of cargo. This immobility was a profound psychological blow. Henry's identity was intrinsically linked to his physical power. His kingship was performative, built on displays of strength, virility, and magnificence. Now, confined to his rooms or trundled slowly through the gardens in a wheeled chair, he was a shadow of his former self. His world had shrunk to the space he could navigate with assistance. The great halls of Hampton Court and Greenwich now echoed with a hollowness that mirrored his own. His diet was both a cause and a symptom of his condition. The Tudor court feasted on a scale that is almost unimaginable to us. A typical meal for the king was a relentless procession of protein and fat. He consumed vast quantities of red meat, roast beef, venison, swan, peacock, all swimming in rich, buttery sauces. There were meat pies, jellies made from boiled animal bones, and sugary custards. He drank ale and wine in enormous quantities, often beginning his day with a draught of one or the other. This was not merely gluttony. It was the diet of a king, a projection of wealth and power. In a world where food was scarce for many, the monarch's table overflowed as a symbol of his kingdom's bounty. But this river of calories, which had fueled his youthful activity, was now poisoning his sedentary body. Modern physicians would diagnose a host of conditions: type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and gout, a painful inflammation of the joints that would have added to his misery and his infamous temper. But more agonizing than the weight, more debilitating than the gout, were his legs. In 1536, a decade before his final decline, Henry had suffered a severe jousting accident at Greenwich. A horse fell on him, crushing his legs and reopening an old wound. This injury never truly healed. It festered, developing into chronic varicose ulcers. By 1546, these ulcers were a constant source of torment. They were open, weeping sores that had to be dressed daily by his physicians. The pain was excruciating, a relentless, throbbing fire in his limbs that would have driven any man to distraction. And then there was the smell. Despite the herbs and perfumes used to mask it, the stench of infection, of decaying flesh, would have been pervasive. This is one of the first of the dark secrets, not a conspiracy, but a raw, sensory reality that is often sanitized in popular histories. The courtiers who approached him, who bowed low and sought his favor, would have had to contend with this smell. They would have seen the grimaces of pain that flickered across his face. They were not dealing with a divine, untouchable monarch. They were dealing with a man in the advanced stages of physical decay, a man whose body was visibly and olfactorily failing him. The treatments were medieval and likely made things worse. His physicians, working with the limited knowledge of the time, would lance the sores to release the evil humors, a process that was not only agonizing, but also introduced new avenues for infection in a pre-germ theory world. They applied poultices of lead and other dubious concoctions, which may have offered temporary relief, but did nothing to address the underlying circulatory problems. The king's daily routine became a litany of managed suffering. He would wake, be helped to wash and dress by his grooms of the stool, a position of immense intimacy and influence, and then begin the business of the day. But that business was constantly interrupted by his physical needs. Meetings of the Privy Council would have to accommodate his inability to sit or stand for long periods. His focus would drift, not from lack of intelligence, but from the overwhelming distraction of his own body's rebellion. The great mind that had schemed its way out of a papal marriage and fundamentally reshaped the religious landscape of his nation was now trapped in a battle it could not win, a war against its own mortal vessel. The king's decline had begun, and as his body weakened, the foundations of the kingdom he had built began to tremble with it. The fog was rolling in, and in the heart of the palace, the once great king sat in his cushioned chair, listening to the slow, inexorable ticking of the clock.
A kingdom on edge. As the king's physical light dimmed within the claustrophobic confines of his private chambers, the kingdom of England held its breath. The state of the monarch's body was inextricably tied to the state of the nation. A strong king meant a stable realm. A weak and ailing king meant uncertainty, anxiety, and opportunity for those who craved power. In 1546, with Henry a volatile and unpredictable force, the entire political and religious landscape of England was a tinderbox, and the court a nest of flickering sparks. The tension was palpable, a low hum of anxiety that vibrated beneath the veneer of courtly life. The political atmosphere was dominated by factions. For years, two main groups had been wrestling for control, positioning themselves for the inevitable moment when the king would be gone. These were not political parties in the modern sense, but loose alliances of powerful nobles and clergymen, bound by shared ambition, religious belief, and family ties. On one side were the religious conservatives, led by men like Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, and Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. They were traditionalists at heart. While they accepted the royal supremacy, they had no choice if they wanted to keep their heads, they yearned for a return to the old Catholic doctrines and rituals. They despised the evangelical reformers, seeing them as dangerous heretics who were tearing apart the fabric of society. Their power base was in the old aristocracy, and a populace still deeply attached to the familiar comforts of the ancient faith. They looked at the king's declining health and saw a chance to roll back the changes, to perhaps even reconcile with Rome under a new monarch. Opposing them were the reformers, the evangelicals. This faction was led by the ambitious and cunning Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, who was the king's brother-in-law through his marriage to Jane Seymour, and the uncle of the heir, Prince Edward. Alongside him were figures like Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and John Dudley, Viscount Lisle. They were Protestant in their sympathies, eager to push the English Reformation further, to purge the church of what they saw as popish superstition and corruption. They championed the English Bible, advocated for justification by faith alone, and saw the king's break with Rome not as an end, but a beginning. Their hope was pinned on the young Prince Edward, who was being raised and educated by tutors of a firmly Protestant persuasion. For them, Henry's death could not come soon enough, as it would usher in a new era and place their man, or rather their boy, on the throne. Henry, even in his infirmity, was acutely aware of this struggle. He was a master of political manipulation, and for years he had skillfully played these factions against each other, a dangerous balancing act that kept any one group from becoming too powerful. He would favor the conservatives one month, throwing a few reformers to the wolves, and then pivot, elevating the evangelicals and humbling their rivals. This kept everyone off balance and utterly dependent on his will. But as his health failed, his grip on this delicate equilibrium began to slip. His decisions became more erratic, his temper more fearsome. A misplaced word, a minor misstep, could lead to the Tower of London. The court became a place of whispered conversations, of coded letters, of watchful eyes and guarded expressions. Every courtier had to navigate this treacherous landscape, guessing which way the ailing king's favor would swing next. The religious upheaval was not just a matter for the elites. It was confusing and unsettling for the entire country.
For centuries, the rhythms of life had been dictated by the Catholic Church. The saints' days, the festivals, the Latin Mass, the confessional. Henry had smashed that world. He had dissolved the monasteries, seizing their immense wealth and land, an act of cultural and economic vandalism that reshaped the nation. He had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Yet the doctrine of his new church was a confused and contradictory hybrid. The Act of 6 Articles, passed in 1539 and known as the Bloody Whip with 6 strings, had brutally reasserted core Catholic tenets like transubstantiation and clerical celibacy, punishing dissent with death. Yet the English Bible was now available, spreading reformist ideas. People were genuinely unsure of what they were supposed to believe. Was it heresy to deny the Pope's authority, or heresy to deny the real presence in the Eucharist? Depending on the political winds, you could be burned for either. This profound uncertainty created a deep-seated spiritual anxiety across the land. The kingdom was on edge, not just politically, but soulfully. Into this cauldron of intrigue and fear, we must also add the financial strain. Henry's ambitions had always outstripped his purse. His magnificent courts, his grand building projects, and above all his pointless and costly wars with France and Scotland had bled the treasury dry. The vast fortunes seized from the monasteries had been squandered. To fund his campaigns in the 1540s, he had resorted to desperate measures. He had debased the coinage, mixing precious metals with base ones in a process that became known as the Great Debasement. This created rampant inflation, sending prices soaring and making life harder for ordinary people. The English economy was faltering, the crown was deeply in debt, and the country was exhausted by war. This was the kingdom that the dying Henry surveyed from his window. It was a nation he had irrevocably changed, but had not left in a state of peace or security. It was a kingdom fraught with division, teetering on the edge of religious civil war, financially crippled, and ruled by a court paralyzed by fear and suspicion. The whispered rumors that we will soon be exploring were not just idle gossip. They were the desperate attempts of a nervous court to make sense of the chaos, to predict the next lurch of the ship of state as its captain lay dying at the helm. The stakes were impossibly high. The fall of one faction could mean ruin, exile, or the executioner's block for its members. The rise of another could change the very soul of England. And all of it depended on the flickering, unpredictable, and rapidly fading life of one ailing, pain-racked man. The kingdom was on edge, waiting for the giant to fall, and wondering what would be left standing in the wreckage.
The weight of the crown of England was never a light burden to bear, but in the final year of Henry VIII's life, its weight became almost geological. It was a pressure that crushed not only from the outside, with the political and religious turmoil we have explored, but also from within, warping the king's mind as surely as his ailments were destroying his body. To understand the reign's final, sputtering phase, we must look at how Henry's physical and mental state became one, creating a feedback loop of pain, paranoia, and power that had profound consequences for the governance of the realm. Imagine the daily reality for Henry. He would awaken not to the clear-headed vigor of a ruler ready to command, but to a fog of pain. The throbbing in his legs would be the first sensation, a constant, malevolent companion. The effort of simply sitting up, of being tended to by his servants, would be an exhausting ordeal. Then would come the business of the day, dispatches to be read, ambassadors to be met, petitions to be heard, justice to be dispensed. But how could a mind focus on the complex subtleties of foreign policy or the dry details of a land dispute when it was being relentlessly assaulted by physical agony? His temper, always formidable, now became legendary and terrifying.
This was not just the imperious wrath of an absolute monarch, but the desperate rage of a man trapped and helpless in his own body. Courtiers described him as choleric and furious. Minor irritations could provoke cataclysmic outbursts. A servant's clumsiness, a courtier's ill-chosen word, or a piece of bad news could unleash a torrent of verbal abuse that left grown men, battle-hardened soldiers, and cunning politicians alike trembling. This volatility made rational governance nearly impossible. Decisions were increasingly made not on the basis of sound policy, but on the king's mood. The Privy Council, the body of advisers meant to help him rule, learned to tread with extreme caution. They would manage the king, carefully choosing the right moment to present difficult news, framing it in a way that was least likely to provoke his anger. This created a dangerous information vacuum around the monarch. Who would dare to bring the king the whole, unvarnished truth if it was likely to result in their disgrace or even their death? It is probable that Henry, in his final year, was one of the most poorly informed men in his own kingdom. He was surrounded by sycophants and factional players who fed him a carefully curated version of reality, one that suited their own agendas. The reformers would highlight the successes of their policies and the supposed treachery of the conservatives. The conservatives would do the exact opposite. Henry, his judgment clouded by pain and a growing paranoia, struggled to see through the fog of misinformation. His paranoia was a natural consequence of his condition. Physical vulnerability often breeds suspicion. As he became more reliant on others, on his physicians to manage his pain, on his servants to move him, on his counselors to govern, his fear of betrayal grew. He had always been suspicious. His reign was littered with the graves of those he had once trusted, from Thomas Wolsey to Thomas Cromwell to two of his own wives. But now this suspicion curdled into a near-constant state of anxiety. He saw plots everywhere. He trusted no one completely. His gaze, once sharp and intelligent, now held a haunted, watchful quality. He would scan the faces of those around him, searching for the slightest flicker of disloyalty. This had a chilling effect on the court. Open debate, the lifeblood of effective counsel, withered. Who would risk proposing a policy that contradicted the king's known opinion? Governance became reactive and short-sighted. Long-term planning was sacrificed for the sake of surviving the next meeting with the king. One of the most significant consequences was on the king's will. The last years of his reign were consumed with the question of the succession and the shape of the government that would rule during his son Edward's minority. The final version of his will became a document of immense political importance, and the factions fought ferociously to influence its contents. Henry's vacillations, his swings of favor, meant that the will was subject to constant revision and last-minute changes, reflecting his shifting suspicions. The future of England was being written and rewritten based on the whims of a dying, pain-addled man. The physical state of the king also impacted the very image of monarchy. Tudor kingship was a performance. The king was God's anointed deputy on earth, and his physical presence was meant to reflect that divine status. He was supposed to be seen by his people, to be magnificent, vital, and awe-inspiring. Henry, in his prime, had excelled at this, but in 1546 he could no longer perform. He was largely hidden from public view. On the rare occasions he was seen, his condition could not be concealed. The sight of the bloated, immobile king being winched onto his horse or carried in a chair undermined the very mystique of the crown. It was a visible, undeniable reminder that the king was mortal, fallible, and decaying. This was a dangerous message in an age that relied on the concept of the king's two bodies. The idea that the king had a mortal, physical body, but also an immortal political body that represented the state. In Henry, these two bodies were collapsing into one, and the decay of the physical was threatening the stability of the political. The weight of the crown was also the weight of his own past. He was haunted by his choices. He had broken with the church of his ancestors, executed friends and wives, and plunged his kingdom into a state of religious confusion. Did he have regrets? It is impossible to know for sure, but some sources hint at a man troubled in his conscience. He ordered that masses be said for his soul in perpetuity, a curiously Catholic-sounding provision for the man who had torn England from Rome. Perhaps in the long, sleepless nights, when the pain in his legs was at its worst, and the flattery of his courtiers had fallen silent, he was forced to confront the legacy he was leaving behind: a contested succession, a divided church, a bankrupt nation. The weight of these failures, combined with his physical suffering and mental anguish, was the true, crushing burden of the crown in his final days. It was a weight that would not be lifted until his very last breath.
The court's whispered rumors. In the suffocating atmosphere of Henry's court, where open speech was a gamble and silence could be mistaken for conspiracy, the primary currency of information was the whisper. Rumors slithered through the tapestry-lined corridors of Whitehall like smoke, curling under heavy oak doors and into the ears of anxious courtiers. They were a symptom of the kingdom's fever, a way for a nervous court to process the unthinkable, the impending death of a king who had reigned for nearly 40 decades. These whispers were a mixture of shrewd observation, wild speculation, and malicious gossip, and they revealed the deep anxieties that plagued the end of his reign. One of the most persistent and dangerous whispers concerned poison. In the 16th century, when medical knowledge was scant and sudden death was common, poison was the default explanation for any unexpected or unpleasant illness in a person of high status. It was the dark art that lurked in the back of every powerful mind. For a king as paranoid as Henry, surrounded by factions desperate for control, the fear of a poisoned cup or a tainted meal was ever present. While there is no credible evidence to suggest Henry was being poisoned, the fear of it was a political force in itself. This fear would have dictated every aspect of his consumption. His food and drink would have been prepared in secure kitchens, overseen by trusted servants. Every dish would have been subject to a ritual of tasting, where a designated person would eat a small portion before the king, a human shield against assassination. But in his final year, as his health visibly collapsed, the rumors would have intensified. Was his slow decay natural, or was it the result of a slow-acting poison, a lingering dose administered by his enemies? The reformers might whisper that Bishop Gardiner's agents were trying to hasten the king's end to prevent him from naming a Protestant regency council. The conservatives would murmur that the Seymour faction, greedy for power, was subtly helping the king toward his grave. These accusations were never made openly, of course. That would be treason. But they were implied, hinted at in private conversations, poisoning the relationships between courtiers and deepening the king's own paranoia. Every physician who attended him, every servant who brought him his meals, fell under a cloud of potential suspicion. Another set of whispers revolved around the true nature of his illness. The official line was that the king suffered from a leg ailment and was otherwise strong. But the evidence of one's own eyes told a different story. Courtiers and ambassadors who saw him wrote encoded dispatches to their masters about his corpulence, his difficulty in breathing, and the foul smell of his leg. This led to endless speculation about the root cause. The jousting accident of 1536 was the common and accepted origin of his leg problems. But was there something more?
This is where the whispers turn to one of the most enduring and controversial theories about Henry's health: syphilis. The Great Pox was a terrifying and shameful disease in the 16th century, associated with sexual promiscuity and ending in madness and death. The rumor that Henry had contracted it, perhaps in his youth, and that his current ailments were the long-term consequences of the disease, was a potent one. It was a secret that, if true, would tarnish his image and the legitimacy of his line. Did his stillborn children and the miscarriages suffered by his wives point to a congenital form of the disease? Did his rages and paranoia signal the onset of neurosyphilis? These were the questions whispered in the shadows. We will delve deeper into the medical evidence for and against this theory later, but for the court of 1546, it was a scandalous and compelling explanation for the king's horrifying decline. It was a rumor that blackened his moral character as much as his physical one. The court also buzzed with scandals of a more immediate nature. The king's sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was a devout and intelligent woman with strong reformist sympathies. She was also in a precarious position. The conservative faction, led by Bishop Gardiner, saw her as a dangerous influence on the king and a key ally of their enemies. In the summer of 1546, they made their move. They began to collect evidence against her, accusing her of heresy. They whispered in the king's ear that his own wife was questioning his religious doctrines, that she was harboring forbidden books. For a time, it seemed they had succeeded. The paranoid king, enraged at the thought of being lectured on theology by his wife, authorized an arrest warrant to be drawn up. The story of Catherine's survival is a testament to her intelligence and courage. Tipped off about the plot, she went to Henry and made a brilliant and submissive appeal. She claimed she had only debated with him to distract him from the pain of his leg and to learn from his great wisdom. Flattered and mollified, the king forgave her. When the guards arrived the next day to arrest her, Henry flew into a rage and dismissed them, verbally abusing the conservative counselors who had orchestrated the plot. The whispers about the Queen's impending doom fell silent, replaced by whispers about the king's mercurial nature and the fall of Bishop Gardiner from favor. This episode shows how high the stakes were. Even the Queen was not safe from the whispers that could lead to the executioner's block. And finally, there were the whispers about the future. With the king so obviously failing, the court was obsessed with the succession. Who would be named to the Regency Council that would rule for the 9-year-old Prince Edward? Every decision Henry made was scrutinized for clues. The appointment of a new gentleman of the Privy Chamber, the granting of a minor piece of land, a harsh word to one lord, a kind one to another, all were parsed for their hidden meaning. The final version of the king's will was the ultimate object of speculation. It was kept under lock and key, its contents a closely guarded secret. But secrets have a way of leaking in a place like a royal court. Rumors about who was in and who was out of the will circulated wildly, causing panic and elation in equal measure. The final days of 1546 saw a desperate last-minute power play by the reformist faction to ensure their dominance of the regency, a move that involved the dramatic downfall of the powerful Howard family. The rumors about their arrest and execution were the last great political bombshell of Henry's reign, a clear signal that the reformers had won the final decisive battle for the king's ear. These whispers, these swirling currents of rumor and speculation, were the soundtrack to Henry's decline. They filled the void left by his retreating authority, revealing a court consumed by fear ambition, and a desperate need to know what the future held. They are a reminder that history is not just made of grand pronouncements and official documents, but also of the quiet, unseen, and often venomous human interactions that shape the destiny of nations.
The King's Final Moments. The final act of Henry VIII's life did not unfold on a grand stage before an audience of his subjects, but in the hushed, candlelit intimacy of his bedchamber at Whitehall Palace. The storms of his reign, the political earthquakes and religious tempests had all receded, leaving only the quiet, elemental struggle of a man against his own mortality. The records of his last hours are sparse, and, as we shall see, politically curated. Yet, by piecing together the accounts that do survive, we can reconstruct a solemn and deeply human scene, the fading of a colossal power into the silence of eternity. By late January 1547, it was clear to everyone in the king's inner circle that the end was near. For several days Henry had been drifting in and out of consciousness, his immense body racked with fever. He was no longer able to engage in the business of state. He was barely able to speak. The governance of the realm had already, in effect, passed to the men of the Privy Council, who gathered in anxious huddles outside his rooms. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere would have been thick with the smell of sickness and the scent of medicinal herbs. The only sounds would have been the crackle of the fire, the low murmur of prayers from his chaplains, and the king's own labored, rattling breaths. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was a constant and gentle presence, but as the final hours approached, she was likely encouraged to withdraw. The deathbed of a king was a political space, a place for men of power, not for the grief of a wife. The key figures present were the physicians, his trusted servants, and a few high-ranking counselors, most notably Sir Anthony Denny, the chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber and a man of reformist sympathies. Denny held a position of unique power. He controlled access to the king, and he held the dry stamp, a replica of the king's signature used to authorize documents that Henry was now too weak to sign himself. The control of this stamp in the king's final days was a matter of supreme political importance. There was a profound and dangerous problem facing the men around the dying king, the Treason Act of 1534. This law, enacted by Henry himself, had made it high treason to predict the king's death. The logic was that such a prediction could itself incite rebellion or a coup. This meant that no one, not even his doctors, dared to tell Henry that he was dying. To do so would be to risk their own lives. So for days his counselors watched him fade, locked in a state of terrified paralysis, unwilling to speak the truth for fear of the consequences. They were trapped by the very laws the man in the bed had created to protect his own power. Finally, on the evening of January 27th, Sir Anthony Denny decided to take the risk. He approached the king's bed and, as gently as he could, informed him that, in man's judgment, he was not like to live, and that he should remember his soul and turn his thoughts to God. It was a moment of incredible tension. Would the dying king, in a final flash of his old, terrifying rage, condemn the man for his honesty? Instead, Henry responded with a quiet lucidity. He said that he believed the mercy of Christ was great enough to pardon all his sins, though they were greater than they be. Then Denny asked him if he wished to see any learned man to confer with. The king, his voice now weak, said that he would see Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But he added that he would take a little sleep first. It was a poignant, human request, the desire for a moment of rest before the final spiritual reckoning. Cranmer, a leading reformer and one of the few men Henry seems to have consistently trusted, was at his palace in Croydon, some 10 miles away. A messenger was dispatched, and the court waited. While they waited, a small, significant drama was unfolding. The king's will,
the document that would dictate the future of England needed to be finalized. The version that existed had been heavily influenced by the reformist faction led by Edward Seymour. But to be legally valid, it needed the king's signature. Henry was now too weak to hold a pen. It is at this point that the dark secret of political manipulation intersects with the king's death. It is almost certain that the final assent to the will was given not by the king's hand, but by the application of the dry stamp, controlled by Denny and his allies. Was the king conscious and consenting when this was done? Or was the stamp applied to a document that the dying, semi-conscious monarch had not fully approved in its final form? The official narrative, of course, insists that all was done according to the king's express command. But the timing is deeply suspicious and suggests that the reformists seized their final opportunity to cement their power, using the king's impending death as their instrument. By the time Archbishop Cranmer arrived at Whitehall, galloping through the cold January night, it was too late. The king had lost the power of speech. The final intimate conversation about faith and the fate of his soul could not happen. Cranmer knelt by the great bed. The chamber would have been silent, save for the rasping breaths of the dying monarch. The archbishop spoke to him, urging him to give some sign that he put his faith in Christ and died in that faith. He asked the king to squeeze his hand. Here, in the final moments, we have a single, powerful image recorded by those present. Henry, the man who had torn his kingdom from the authority of one church and made himself the head of another, the man whose life was a tapestry of ruthless ambition and, perhaps, of troubled faith, reached out. He could not speak, but he could still feel. According to the account, he held Cranmer's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. It was his last act, a silent affirmation. Shortly after, in the early morning of Friday, January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died. The official time of death was recorded at around 2 a.m. He was 55 years old and had reigned for 37 years and 9 months. For a time, his death was kept a secret. The councillors needed time to secure their positions and to arrange for the smooth proclamation of the new king, the 9-year-old Edward VI. For 2 days, the machine of the court continued as if the king were still alive. Meals were brought to his chambers, and guards stood watch. It was a charade, designed to prevent panic and political instability. Finally, on Monday, January 31st, the Lord Chancellor announced to a tearful Parliament that their great and fearsome king was dead. The giant had fallen, and the silence he left behind was for a moment deafening. But it would not last long. The struggle for his legacy and for the soul of the kingdom he had created was only just beginning.
What historians didn't say. History, as it is often told, is a story of straight lines and clear narratives. It tidies up the messy, uncomfortable realities of the past, presenting a version of events that is coherent and often serves the agenda of those who write it. In the case of Henry VIII's death, the official story, crafted by the victorious reformist faction, was one of a pious king dying peacefully in his faith, leaving behind a carefully planned will to ensure the stability of the realm. But this is a carefully edited picture. The dark secret we are exploring is not a hidden conspiracy, but the vast and murky truth that lies in the omissions, the silences, and the carefully chosen words of the official record. What the first historians didn't say is, in many ways, more revealing than what they did. Let us first consider the primary source for the king's final moments, the account written or heavily influenced by men who had everything to gain from a particular version of events. Sir Anthony Denny, who coaxed the dying king into calling for Cranmer, and Archbishop Cranmer himself, who received that final hand squeeze, were key members of the ascendant Protestant faction.
Their narrative presents a king who, at the very end, firmly and finally rejected the superstitions of the old Catholic faith. The request for Cranmer, a married archbishop and a committed reformer, instead of a conservative bishop like Stephen Gardiner, was presented as Henry's definitive choice for a Protestant future. The hand squeeze was the seal on that choice. But what is omitted from this tidy scene? There is no mention of the king's profound terror, his notorious temper, or the chaos of his sick room. There is no hint of the political maneuvering that was happening just outside his door. The account smooths over the deeply problematic issue of the Treason Act, which had kept everyone silent for days. Denny's brave act of informing the king of his impending death is framed as simple loyalty, not as a calculated risk taken when it was clear the king was too weak to retaliate. The narrative is clean, pious, and politically convenient. It retrospectively makes Henry into the Protestant saint the new regime needed him to be. The most significant omission, and the one that borders on a political conspiracy, concerns the king's will. The official story is that Henry dictated his final wishes, and they were dutifully transcribed and signed. However, the sequence of events suggests a far murkier reality. The will named a regency council of 16 executors, with a careful balance of power, or so it seemed. But crucially, the conservative faction's most powerful leaders were excluded. Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, was inexplicably struck from the list of executors. Henry's reported reason was that Gardiner was too willful and troublesome. This is a remarkably thin justification for excluding one of the most senior and experienced men in the kingdom. Was this truly Henry's decision, made in a moment of lucidity? Or was it the suggestion of his reformist attendants, whispered into the ear of a dying man who was easily swayed? The records are silent on the debate that must have preceded this momentous decision. Even more dramatic was the complete downfall of the Howard family. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, was the premier nobleman of England and a staunch conservative. His son, Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, was a gifted poet, but also arrogant and reckless. In December 1546, just a month before the king's death, both men were arrested on trumped-up charges of treason. The primary evidence against Surrey was that he had improperly used the royal arms of Edward the Confessor in his own heraldry, a flimsy pretext that was interpreted as a sign that he had designs on the throne. Surrey was tried and executed on January 19, 1547. His father, the Duke of Norfolk, was sentenced to die on January 28th. He was saved from the block only by the fact that the king himself died in the early morning of that very morning. The official chronicles present this as a necessary and just punishment for treason. What they don't say is that the charges were pursued with suspicious speed and vigor by the Seymour faction. The fall of the Howards conveniently removed the single greatest obstacle to Edward Seymour's ambition to become Lord Protector, the sole ruler of the Regency. Was the paranoid king manipulated into destroying his last great conservative bulwark? The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. The reformers around him controlled access. They filtered the information he received, and they likely fanned the flames of his suspicion against the Howards. The official history records a king defending his lineage. The omitted history suggests a king being used as a puppet by those who sought to seize power. Then there is the silence surrounding the physical reality of the king's death. The accounts are sterile. They speak of a fever and a weakness. They do not speak of the morbid obesity, the foul-smelling weeping ulcers, the bedsores, the incontinence, and the sheer undignified horror of a body in its final stages of systemic failure. To mention these things would be to undermine the majesty of the king. It would make him seem too human, too grotesque. History, particularly Tudor history, demanded a good death, a mors bona, where the dying individual reconciles with God and passes with dignity. The reality of Henry's death was almost certainly the opposite, a messy, painful, and foul-smelling affair. This visceral truth was one of the first things to be scrubbed from the record. Furthermore, later Protestant historians, like John Foxe, in his famous Book of Martyrs, actively embellished the narrative to serve their own purposes. Foxe turned Henry into a proto-Protestant hero, a Moses who led his people out of the darkness of Roman Catholicism. In this telling, his flaws were downplayed, and his break with Rome was presented as a purely theological crusade, rather than the desperate act of a man obsessed with securing a male heir. The messy details of his final days, the lingering Catholic elements of his faith, like his provision for masses for his soul, and the political chicanery surrounding his will, were all conveniently ignored. What the historians didn't say was that Henry's death was not a neat conclusion, but a chaotic and manipulated event. They didn't say that the future of England's religion and politics was likely decided not by the king's will, but by the will of those who controlled the dry stamp. They didn't say that the new regime began with a purge of its rivals, orchestrated around a dying man's paranoia. And they didn't say that the image of the great king, dying piously in his bed, was a carefully constructed piece of political propaganda. The dark secret, then, is the gap between the myth and the reality, a gap filled with political ambition, human frailty, and the raw, unsanitized truth of a painful and undignified end.
Medical mysteries. To journey deeper into the shadows surrounding Henry VIII's death, we must turn from the political chamber to the sick room and ask a fundamental question. What exactly killed the king? The official story, both then and now, is deceptively simple. He died from complications arising from his chronic leg ulcers and his extreme obesity. This is undoubtedly true, but it is also profoundly incomplete. It is like describing a forest fire as being caused by a lit match. It tells us the immediate cause, but ignores the vast, dry landscape that allowed the blaze to spread. The body of Henry VIII in 1547 was just such a landscape, and a closer look reveals a cascade of systemic failures and medical mysteries that modern science is still trying to unravel. Let's begin with the accepted causes. His morbid obesity, with an estimated body mass index of over 50, would have placed an unimaginable strain on his entire system. His heart, encased in fat, would have struggled to pump blood through his massive frame. This likely led to congestive heart failure, which would explain symptoms like shortness of breath. The sheer weight would have compressed his lungs, making him susceptible to respiratory infections like pneumonia, a common killer in the pre-antibiotic era. His diet, rich in purines from red meat and alcohol, was the textbook cause of gout, an excruciatingly painful form of arthritis. Furthermore, it is almost certain that he suffered from type 2 diabetes, a condition that would have severely compromised his circulation and his body's ability to heal, making his leg ulcers all the more intractable. These ulcers are central to the mystery. The story that they originated from a 1536 jousting accident is well established, but for a wound to remain open and festering for over a decade points to a deeper, underlying pathology. Diabetes alone would be a major contributing factor. However, the condition that likely turned these ulcers into a lethal problem was osteomyelitis. This is a severe and deep-seated infection of the bone itself, which would have been situated directly beneath the open sores on his shin. In the 16th century, there was no effective treatment for osteomyelitis. It would have been a relentless source of bacteria pouring directly into his bloodstream. This leads us to the most probable immediate cause of his death, sepsis.
Sepsis, or blood poisoning, is the body's overwhelming and life-threatening response to an infection. When the leg ulcers and the underlying osteomyelitis released a constant flood of bacteria into his system, his body would have launched a massive, uncontrolled inflammatory response. This would cause a high fever, a rapid heart rate, and a drop in blood pressure, leading to organ failure. The descriptions of his final days, the fever, the delirium, the eventual loss of consciousness, are a classic picture of a patient dying from septic shock. So, the simple narrative holds. The ulcers led to an infection that killed him. But this is where the deeper mysteries begin. Was there something else at play? A primary condition that caused or exacerbated all these other symptoms? This is where modern medical historians have proposed a number of fascinating, though improvable, theories. One compelling hypothesis, put forward by researcher Katrina Banks-Whiteley, is that Henry suffered from a rare genetic disorder called McLeod syndrome. This is a condition linked to the Kell blood group, and it can cause a host of symptoms that align remarkably well with Henry's case. It often appears in middle age and can lead to leg sores, cognitive decline, including paranoia and memory loss, and heart problems. Intriguingly, it can also affect reproductive health, potentially explaining the miscarriages and stillbirths suffered by his wives. If Henry carried the Kell-positive gene and his partners were Kell-negative, it could have triggered an immune response in the mother, leading to the death of the fetus. This single genetic theory could tie together his physical decay, his mental decline, and his desperate, tragic quest for a male heir. Another theory points to Cushing's syndrome, a condition caused by an excess of the hormone cortisol. This can be caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland. The symptoms of Cushing's syndrome include rapid weight gain, particularly in the torso and face, creating a moon face appearance often seen in Henry's later portraits, thin skin that bruises easily, muscle weakness, and psychological disturbances, including depression and paranoia. It could explain his dramatic transformation from a vigorous athlete into an obese and irritable invalid. And what of the whispers of poison? While assassination by a single dose is unlikely, could long-term, low-level poisoning have contributed to his decline? His physicians, in their desperate attempts to treat him, prescribed all manner of toxic substances. Ointments containing lead and mercury were commonly applied to sores. While intended to be topical, these heavy metals can be absorbed through broken skin, leading to chronic poisoning over time. The symptoms of mercury poisoning include irritability and emotional instability, while lead poisoning can cause gout-like pains and cognitive impairment. It's possible that the very cures meant to heal him were in fact slowly killing him. Finally, we must consider the limitations of a historical diagnosis. We are working with incomplete, non-clinical descriptions written by lay people over 450 years ago. We have no body, no tissue samples, no DNA tests. Every diagnosis is an act of interpretation, a medical ghost story told from centuries away. The mystery is not just which disease he had, but the sheer number of comorbidities. It's likely there was no single cause of death, but a cascade of failure. His obesity, diabetes, hypertension, gout, ulcers, and bone infection created a perfect storm of pathology. Each condition made the others worse. His immobility from the ulcers and gout worsened the obesity. The obesity and probable diabetes prevented the ulcers from healing. The constant pain and infection fueled his paranoia and rage. His body was a collapsing ecosystem. The greatest medical mystery, then, may not be a specific undiscovered disease, but the sheer resilience of the man. For a decade, he endured a level of chronic pain and infection that would have incapacitated most people entirely. Yet he continued to rule, to command, to shape the destiny of his nation. The story of his death is not just a tale of disease, but a testament to a formidable, if not terrifying, will to power. A will that kept fighting, long after his body had surrendered. The role of syphilis. Of all the whispered rumors and medical theories surrounding Henry VIII's health, none has captured the imagination quite like the specter of syphilis. It is a deeply compelling narrative. The great king, known for his appetites and his string of wives, brought low by a shameful venereal disease. The idea has permeated popular culture, becoming an almost accepted fact in films and television series, where it serves as a convenient and dramatic explanation for his tyranny, his madness, and his tragic reproductive history. But as we settle into the quiet examination of history, we must ask, does the evidence actually support this notorious diagnosis? Or is it a historical myth, a black legend, that is more revealing of our desire for a moralizing story than of the medical facts? The theory is, on the surface, quite plausible. Syphilis, the Great Pox, had swept across Europe in the late 15th century and was a well-known, if poorly understood, terror in Tudor England. It was transmitted sexually, and Henry, especially in his youth, was no monk. While he was not the rampant womanizer some later accounts suggest, he certainly had mistresses, most famously Bessie Bloint and Mary Boleyn. It is entirely possible that he could have contracted the disease as a young man. The proponents of the syphilis theory point to a compelling list of symptoms. First and foremost is the king's disastrous obstetric history. Primary syphilis can be passed from a mother to her child, often resulting in miscarriage, stillbirth, or the death of the infant shortly after birth. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, suffered a string of tragic pregnancies. Of at least 6, only one, Mary, survived. Anne Boleyn also had miscarriages. Could Henry have been the source of an infection that he passed to his wives, who then passed it to their unborn children? It's a neat and tragic explanation for his desperate and seemingly cursed quest for an heir. Then there are the symptoms of tertiary syphilis, the final stage of the disease, which can manifest decades after the initial infection. These can include cardiovascular problems, debilitating bone pain, and large ulcerating sores called gummas. To the untrained eye, Henry's weeping leg ulcers look very much like the classic description of syphilitic gummas. And most damningly, tertiary syphilis can attack the central nervous system, leading to a condition called neurosyphilis. The symptoms of neurosyphilis are a chilling match for Henry's later character: grandiose delusions, memory loss, impaired judgment, and violent, unpredictable rages. The theory paints a clear picture. A young king contracts syphilis, it lies dormant for years, and then reemerges in his middle age to destroy his body, his mind, and his chances of a healthy dynasty. However, when we look more closely, with a calmer and more skeptical eye, the case for syphilis begins to weaken considerably. Firstly, the treatments. The standard and only known treatment for syphilis in the 16th century was mercury. It was a brutal and toxic therapy, administered by rubbing it into the skin, ingesting it, or inhaling its vapor in a heated chamber. The side effects were horrific, including profuse salivation, tooth loss, and neurological damage. Yet in all the detailed records of Henry's many medical treatments, there is not a single unambiguous mention of him ever undergoing a course of mercury therapy. Given the openness with which his other ailments were discussed and treated, this silence is significant. It is possible it was kept secret due to the disease's shameful nature, but for a king whose every bodily function was a matter of state, such a secret would have been difficult to keep. Secondly, the nature of the symptoms themselves can be questioned. While his obstetric history is tragic, it can also be explained by other factors. The aforementioned Kell blood group theory provides a compelling genetic alternative. Simple bad luck and the generally high rates of infant mortality in the Tudor period also play a role. Rh incompatibility between Henry and his wives is another possibility. Syphilis is not the only explanation. The leg ulcers, too, may not be what they seem. While they resemble gummas, their origin is very clearly and consistently traced in contemporary sources back to the 1536 jousting injury.
They are described as varicose ulcers, a result of poor circulation in his legs exacerbated by his weight and a severe physical trauma. This is much more direct and less speculative diagnosis than tertiary syphilis. And what of the madness? Henry's rages and paranoia, while extreme, do not necessarily require a diagnosis of neurosyphilis. As we have explored, the constant, excruciating pain from his legs, gout, and other ailments is more than enough to explain his monstrous temper. A man in perpetual agony is not likely to be a man of gentle disposition. His paranoia was fueled by the real and ever-present factional struggles at his court. When people actually are plotting against you, suspicion is a rational response, not necessarily a sign of insanity. He remained even to the end a shrewd and capable political operator when his pain and anger allowed it. He was not a gibbering lunatic, he was a tyrant in agony. Perhaps the most compelling argument against the syphilis diagnosis is Henry's children who did survive. Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth were all highly intelligent, and while not without their own health issues, they showed none of the classic signs of congenital syphilis, which can include blindness, deafness, and bone deformities. Elizabeth I, in particular, was one of the most intellectually brilliant monarchs in English history. So why does the syphilis myth persist? It persists because it is a good story. It provides a moralistic and satisfyingly ironic narrative. The king who broke with the Catholic Church over his desire for a son was, in this telling, the very cause of his own problem. His sexual sins came back to destroy him and his dynastic hopes. It's a tale of hubris and divine retribution. But calm, reflective history must be wary of stories that are too neat, too perfect. The reality of Henry's health was likely a far more complex and mundane collection of ailments: obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and a festering wound. The syphilis theory, while tantalizing, remains one of the great unproven rumors of the Tudor court, a whispered secret that tells us more about our need to find a simple cause for a complex and tragic decline than it does about the king himself.
The king's wounds. Let us now draw our focus away from the grand theories and speculative diagnoses and center our attention on a concrete and undeniable reality of Henry VIII's final years: his wounds. We are not speaking of the wounds of battle, for he saw little of that himself, nor the metaphorical wounds to his pride. We are speaking of the literal, physical wounds on his legs, the chronic, suppurating ulcers that became the focal point of his existence. To truly understand the man in his final decline, we must try to imagine the daily, hourly experience of living with this condition. It was a private torment that had very public consequences, a source of constant pain that poisoned his body and his mind. The story of these wounds begins 2 decades before his death with his youthful passion for the joust. Henry was a superb athlete, and the joust was the ultimate expression of martial and courtly skill, but it was also a brutal and dangerous sport. He suffered several injuries over the years, but the critical event occurred in January 1536 at a tournament in Greenwich. He was 44 years old, no longer the slender youth of his accession, but still powerful. Accounts vary, but it seems his fully armored horse, also in armor, stumbled and fell, throwing the king to the ground. Then the immense weight of the horse rolled on top of him, crushing his leg. The impact was so severe that he was knocked unconscious for 2 hours. The court thought he was dead. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, reported that the king was without speech. When he awoke, he seemed to have recovered, but the injury to his leg could never properly heal. It is likely that the crushing blow caused severe trauma to the veins in his lower leg, damaging the valves that help push blood back up toward the heart. This condition, known as venous insufficiency, would have been massively exacerbated by his increasing weight and sedentary lifestyle. blood began to pool in his lower legs, causing swelling or edema, and making the skin fragile and prone to breaking down. An old wound, possibly from a previous jousting accident, reopened, and this time it would not close. This was the birth of his chronic varicose ulcers. From 1536 onwards, the care of his legs became a central part of his daily routine. Imagine the scene, repeated day after day, year after year. The king's physicians, a grim-faced group of men, including the respected Dr. William Butts, would attend him. The old bandages, soaked with pus and blood, would be carefully unwound. The stench, a sickly sweet smell of infection and decay, would fill the room. A smell that even the strongest perfumes and burning incense could not entirely conquer. The ulcers themselves would have been a horrific sight. Open, crater-like sores with red, inflamed edges and a grayish, weeping center. The pain must have been immense. Ulcers of this nature expose nerve endings, creating a constant, burning and throbbing sensation. Any slight touch, the brush of a blanket, the pressure of his own weight would have sent jolts of agony through him. He would have been unable to stand for long periods, and walking would have been a slow, shuffling torment. This explains his reliance on wheeled chairs and being carried. The pain would have been a constant companion, a background noise to every conversation, every decision, every waking moment. It is this pain that provides the most direct and human explanation for his infamous temper. It is difficult to maintain a sunny disposition when you are in a state of perpetual agony. The treatments of the age were a catalogue of well-intentioned torture. Believing that the ulcers were releasing evil humors from the body, his physicians would sometimes cauterize them with hot irons to stop them from healing over, thinking it was beneficial to keep them open and draining. They applied poultices made from a variety of ingredients, some soothing, like bread and milk, others caustic and dangerous, containing lead, mercury, or arsenic. They would regularly lance and bleed the area, a painful procedure that offered no real benefit and increased the risk of deeper infection. This brings us to the most lethal aspect of the wounds: infection. In a world without germ theory or antibiotics, an open wound of this nature was a gateway for every kind of bacteria. The ulcers became a breeding ground for infection, which likely burrowed deeper over the years, penetrating the muscle and bone to cause osteomyelitis that we have discussed. This chronic low-grade infection would have periodically flared up, causing bouts of high fever, chills, and delirium. Each flare-up would have been a life-threatening event. His body was in a constant state of war, its resources drained by the endless battle against the bacteria colonizing his legs. This chronic inflammation would have accelerated the aging process and contributed to the failure of other organ systems. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For a man whose identity was built on an image of physical perfection and masculine power, these foul, weeping wounds were a source of profound shame and humiliation. They were a visible, smelly, undeniable symbol of his weakness and decay. He, who was the supreme head of the church and the all-powerful king, could not command his own body to heal. This helplessness must have been infuriating. It is no coincidence that his worst bouts of tyranny, his most paranoid and violent decisions, occurred in the years after the Greenwich accident. The fall of Anne Boleyn happened just a few months after the injury. The brutal Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion was suppressed with merciless cruelty a year later. It is a compelling, if unsettling thought, that the course of English history, the fates of queens and rebels, may have been directly influenced by the throbbing pain in a king's decaying leg. The wounds were not just a medical condition, they were a political one, a dark and agonizing secret that shaped the final bloody chapter of his reign. As we draw the curtains on this exploration of Henry's physical decay, we must turn to its dark reflection, the decay of his mind. The line between physical suffering and mental anguish is never a clear one, and in Henry's case, the two were so deeply intertwined as to be inseparable. Was the king truly mad in his final years, or was he a rational, if ruthless man, driven to extremes by pain and pressure? The answer, like so much about Henry, is complex and lies in the shadowy space between sanity and its breaking point. This was not the raving lunacy of fiction, but a more insidious kind of mental decline, a curdling of the personality that turned a once charismatic monarch into a figure of terror. The most obvious manifestation of his mental change was his paranoia. In his youth, Henry was known for his open, affable nature. He inspired genuine loyalty and affection. By 1546, that man was gone, replaced by a suspicious, brooding tyrant who saw enemies in every shadow. This was not entirely without cause. He ruled a court that was a viper's nest of factional intrigue, and plots against him were a real and constant threat. However, his paranoia began to exceed the bounds of rational caution. He turned on men who had served him faithfully for decades, like Thomas Cromwell. He sent 2 of his wives to the executioner's block based on charges fueled by his own deep-seated insecurities. In his final year, this paranoia reached its zenith. The affair of the Howards is a prime example. The charge that the Earl of Surrey was plotting to usurp the throne was based on the flimsiest of evidence, his use of a coat of arms, to which he had a plausible, if debatable, claim. A younger, more secure Henry might have dismissed it with a warning. The old, ailing Henry saw it as proof of a deep-laid conspiracy against his son, and it cost Surrey his life. His wife, Catherine Parr, a woman who nursed him with genuine care, was nearly arrested for heresy because she dared to engage him in a theological debate. His suspicion became a weapon, easily aimed by those around him who knew how to play on his deepest fears. Then there was the rage. Henry's temper was always a force to be reckoned with, but in his later years it became volcanic and unpredictable. The constant grinding pain from his legs and other ailments undoubtedly lowered his threshold for frustration. The Spanish ambassador once noted that the king's temper was such that he is a man who in his anger is inexorable. Courtiers learned to read his moods like weather vanes, knowing that a storm could break at any moment. These were not calculated displays of anger, designed to intimidate, as they might have been in his prime. They were frightening, uncontrolled outbursts of a man at the end of his tether. This rage made reasoned counsel impossible, and turned a court into a place of fear. Everyone, from the highest lord to the lowliest servant, lived in terror of provoking him. We must also consider the possibility of cognitive impairment. Did his physical ailments affect his ability to think clearly? It is very likely. The chronic infections raging in his body would have caused recurrent fevers and delirium. In these states, his judgment would have been severely compromised. Some historians have pointed to a possible head injury from the 1536 jousting accident as a source of his personality change. A traumatic brain injury could certainly explain a shift towards impulsivity, emotional volatility, and paranoia. While there is no definitive proof of a lasting brain injury, the timeline fits. His behavior becomes noticeably more tyrannical and erratic in the years following that fall. Furthermore, his ego, always colossal, seems to have inflated to pathological proportions in his final years. He had declared himself supreme head of the church, effectively placing himself as God's deputy on earth. He began to believe in his own theological infallibility. The man who had once encouraged debate and surrounded himself with brilliant thinkers like Thomas More and Erasmus now demanded absolute intellectual submission. To question his religious pronunciations was heresy, punishable by a horrific death at the stake. This theological vanity, combined with his paranoia, created a deadly environment for anyone with an independent mind. Was this madness? If we mean by madness a complete break from reality, then probably not. On his good days, when the pain was manageable, Henry could still be a shrewd and commanding ruler. He was still capable of understanding complex legal and political arguments. He played a key role in designing the final version of his will, a document of immense complexity. This was not the mind of a man lost to delusion. Instead, it is perhaps more accurate to describe his condition as a severe personality disorder, massively exacerbated by a host of physical torments. He was a man with narcissistic and paranoid traits whose worst tendencies were unleashed by chronic pain, physical helplessness, and the corrupting influence of absolute power. The monster that terrorized the court was also a man in a private hell, a king whose mind had become the most frightening and inescapable dungeon of all.
The heirs and the succession crisis. As the great tree of Henry VIII's life began to totter, the most pressing question for the entire kingdom was what would happen when it finally fell. For all his power, his wars, and his religious revolution, Henry's single-minded obsession for over 2 decades had been the succession. He had torn his kingdom from its ancient religious foundations, discarded loyal wives, and executed trusted advisors, all in the pursuit of a secure, undisputed male heir. As he lay dying, he had his precious son, Edward. But the legacy he left his children was not one of stability, but a tangled, poisoned inheritance of religious division, political uncertainty, and personal trauma. The succession crisis he had fought so hard to avoid was, in reality, just beginning. Henry left behind 3 children, each a product of a different wife and a different phase of his tumultuous reign, and each representing a different possible future for England. They were not a united family, but 3 rival figureheads, their very existence a reminder of the king's marital chaos. First, there was Mary, the eldest. She was the daughter of the repudiated Catherine of Aragon, a living symbol of the old Catholic faith and the alliance with Spain. For much of her life, Mary had been subjected to profound psychological cruelty. After her parents' divorce, she had been declared illegitimate, stripped of her title of princess, and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her own infant half-sister, Elizabeth. She had been separated from her mother and pressured relentlessly to accept her father's religious supremacy and her own bastardy. She only reconciled with her father late in his reign after being forced to submit, an act that caused her deep spiritual anguish. By 1547, she was a woman in her early 30s, hardened by years of suffering, unyielding in her Catholic faith, and deeply resentful of the reformers who had ruined her mother and her own early life. To the conservatives and the many English people who still clung to the old ways, she was the rightful heir after Edward, a beacon of hope for a return to Rome. Then came Elizabeth, the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn. Like Mary, she too had been declared illegitimate after her mother's fall from grace. She was a precocious and remarkably intelligent child, raised in the Protestant faith under the guidance of reformist tutors like Roger Ascham. She had learned from a terrifyingly young age the arts of survival at the Tudor court, to be watchful, to be guarded, to keep her own counsel.
In 1547, she was a teenager of 13, an unknown quantity to many, but already displaying the sharp intellect and cautious temperament that would one day define her own glorious reign. To the moderate Protestants, she was another hope for the future, a potential guarantor of her father's church should her young brother fail to live to manhood. And finally, there was Edward, the jewel in the crown, the son Henry had craved for so long. He was the child of Jane Seymour, the only one of Henry's wives to be given a queen's funeral. Born in 1537, he was only 9 years old when his father died. He was, by all accounts, a serious, intelligent, and fiercely devout boy, but he was a child nonetheless. His religious education had been entirely in the hands of the reformist faction. Tutors like Roger Cox and John Cheek had molded him into a fervent, almost fanatical Protestant who saw the Pope as the Antichrist and the Catholic Mass as idolatry. He was the reformers' trump card, the vessel through which they could complete the English Reformation and purge the kingdom of all remaining Catholic vestiges. But his youth and his fragile health, he was never a robust child, made him a vulnerable linchpin for the future. A boy king could not rule in his own right. Power would lie with a regency council, and the fight to control that council, and thus the king himself, was the central political drama of Henry's final days. Henry, in his final will, attempted to solve this conundrum with a characteristically complex and controlling solution. He painstakingly restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, after Edward and his potential heirs. This was a remarkable act, given that he never officially repealed the Acts of Parliament that had declared them illegitimate. It was a legal fudge, a testament to his desire to keep the crown within his own bloodline, no matter how complicated. But by placing them back in the line, he created 3 potential poles of loyalty. He was, in effect, setting up a future conflict between his fiercely Catholic daughter and his fiercely Protestant son. His will decreed that England should be governed not by a single Lord Protector, but by a balanced council of 16 executors. This was his attempt to continue his policy of ruling from beyond the grave, playing the factions against each other to prevent any one man from seizing absolute power. It was a clever plan on paper, but it completely underestimated the ambition of the men he had appointed. He had created a recipe not for stability, but for a power vacuum and a subsequent coup. The political consequences of his death were not a smooth transition, but an immediate and ruthless power struggle that would pit his children against each other and plunge the kingdom into more than a decade of profound instability. The crisis he thought he had solved by fathering Edward was in fact just beginning, and its protagonists would be the 3 lonely, traumatized children he left behind. The power struggle begins. The king's final breath was not an end to the political maneuvering at court. It was the starting gun for a new and more desperate race. For years, the factions had been circling, waiting for the moment of weakness. Now, that moment had come. Henry's carefully constructed plan for a balanced regency council, designed to prevent any single person from becoming too powerful, was a fantasy. It was a plan made by a man who could not imagine a world that did not revolve around his will. The ink was barely dry on his testament before the reformist faction, led by the coolly ambitious Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and uncle to the new king, made their move. The power struggle did not begin with Henry's death. It was won in the hours and days surrounding it. The first step was control of information. As we have seen, Henry's death at 2 a.m. on January 28th was kept a state secret for 3 days. This was not a period of respectful mourning. It was a critical window of opportunity. While the kingdom at large believed the old king still lived, Seymour and his allies were consolidating their power. They had possession of the king's will. They had physical custody of the new 9-year-old king, Edward VI, whom they swiftly brought from Hertford to the Tower of London, not as a prisoner, but for his safety, which in Tudor politics meant for his control. And they had control of the narrative. The key to their coup was the subversion of Henry's will. The will had stipulated a council of 16 equals. Seymour had no intention of being merely one of 16. His argument, put to the other councillors in a series of secret meetings held before the king's death was even announced, was simple and compelling. A council of equals would be slow, faction-ridden, and inefficient. The kingdom, especially with the threat of foreign enemies and internal religious dissent, needed a single, strong hand at the tiller. It needed a protector, and who better for that role than the new king's own uncle? To achieve this, Seymour employed a mixture of persuasion, bribery, and subtle intimidation. He and his allies, like Sir William Paget, another executor, argued that they were not overturning the late king's will, but merely making it more effective. Promises were made. Those who supported Seymour's bid for the protectorship could expect to be rewarded with titles, lands, and offices. Peerages were dangled like carrots. John Dudley, a key ally, was promised the earldom of Warwick. Seymour himself would become the Duke of Somerset. This was a flagrant use of the crown's patronage to buy political support, a direct contradiction of the spirit of Henry's balanced counsel. Those who might have objected were either neutralized or outmaneuvered. The conservative faction was already in disarray. Their leader, the Duke of Norfolk, was in the Tower, condemned to death. Their other great figurehead, Bishop Stephen Gardiner, had been excluded from the will entirely. The Lord Chancellor, Thomas Wriothesley, a conservative, did object to Seymour's power grab. He argued fiercely for the letter of the king's will to be upheld. But he was isolated. Within weeks of the new reign, Seymour and the council found a pretext to strip Wriothesley of his office and remove him from the council. The opposition was silenced. On February 1st, just after the king's death was finally made public, the executors met and formally agreed to appoint Seymour as Lord Protector of the realm and governor of the king's person. They had effectively torn up Henry's primary instruction for the governance of the minority. The power struggle was over before it had even begun in public. Seymour had won. This immediate consolidation of power had profound consequences. It meant that the English Reformation, which had stalled and even retreated in Henry's final years, was about to be unleashed with a new and more radical fervor. Henry had envisioned a church that was Catholic in doctrine, but English in leadership. Seymour, Cranmer, and the new regime had a very different vision, a truly Protestant England. With Seymour as protector, Archbishop Cranmer was given free rein to begin dismantling the old ways. The Act of 6 Articles was repealed. The Latin Mass was on its way out, to be replaced by a new English prayer book. Priests were allowed to marry. The destruction of religious imagery in churches, which Henry had tried to control, was now actively encouraged. The country was about to be propelled into a religious revolution far more extreme than anything Henry had ever intended. The power struggle also revealed the fragility of Henry's legacy. He had built a system of personal monarchy that was entirely dependent on his own force of personality. Once he was gone, the structures he had created proved to be hollow. His will, the final expression of his autocratic power, was cast aside in a matter of days. The men who he had raised to power, like Seymour, used the very skills of ruthless ambition they had learned at Henry's court to subvert his last wishes. It was a quiet, bloodless, but utterly effective coup, carried out in the shadowy corridors of Whitehall while the old king's body was still laying in its chamber. The dark secret here is one of breathtaking cynicism. The men who publicly mourned the great king and lauded his wisdom were the very same men who were privately dismantling his final and most important political testament to secure their own futures. The king was dead, and the vultures were already feasting on the carcass of his authority.
The role of Catherine Parr. In the gallery of Henry VIII's wives, Catherine Parr is often overlooked. She lacks the tragic pathos of Catherine of Aragon, the revolutionary glamour of Anne Boleyn, or the youthful innocence of Jane Seymour. She was not discarded, beheaded, or the mother of the long-awaited heir. She was the survivor, the sixth and final wife, a twice-widowed woman who took on the role of nursemaid and companion to the ailing, tyrannical king.
but to see her merely as a matronly caretaker is to profoundly underestimate her. In the final, fraught years of Henry's reign, Queen Catherine Parr was a figure of immense significance, a subtle political operator, a passionate religious reformer, and a stabilizing maternal presence in the lives of the king's damaged children. Her influence in his final days was quiet but deeply felt. Catherine came to the throne in 1443, a mature and intelligent woman of 31. She had been married twice before to older men, and she brought a sense of calm and domestic stability to the court, which had been rocked by the scandal and execution of Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Her relationship with Henry was less one of passionate romance and more one of companionable affection. He was by this point a man in his 50s, obese, in constant pain, and in need of gentle management. Catherine excelled at this. She nursed his ulcerous leg, engaged him in conversation, and managed his volatile moods with a deftness that impressed all who saw it. The Spanish ambassador noted that she showed the king so much love and deference, and that her great virtue was her gentle entertainment of him. But beneath this veneer of wifely submission was a woman of formidable intellect and deep religious conviction. Catherine was a committed evangelical Protestant, a quiet but zealous proponent of the Reformation. Her household became a hub for reformist thinkers and preachers. She read and discussed forbidden works of theology, and even wrote her own religious devotional, Prayers or Meditations, the first book to be published by an English queen under her own name. This was a dangerous game to play. Henry's church was fundamentally conservative in its doctrine, and the king himself had a deep-seated hatred of what he called heretic wives. Her influence was most clearly felt in the education of the royal children. She became a loving and effective stepmother to Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, bringing them together under one roof and creating a semblance of a family life they had never known. She took a particular interest in the education of Elizabeth and Edward, ensuring they were taught by the brightest reformist minds of the day, men like John Cheek and Roger Ascham. By shaping the intellectual and spiritual world of the heir to the throne, Catherine was playing the long game. She was ensuring that the next generation of the Tudor dynasty would be unequivocally Protestant. This was perhaps her most lasting and significant contribution to the English Reformation. Her position, however, was perilous. As we have seen, in 1446, the conservative faction at court, led by Bishop Gardiner and Chancellor Wriothesley, saw her as a prime target. They viewed her religious influence on the king and the children as a mortal threat. They meticulously built a case against her, compiling evidence of her heretical beliefs and presenting it to the paranoid king. For a terrifying moment, it seemed they had succeeded. Henry, infuriated by his wife's attempts to debate theology with him, authorized her arrest. An arrest warrant for the Queen of England was drawn up. The story of her survival is a masterclass in political skill. Tipped off by the plot, Catherine did not panic. She went to her husband, and with a brilliant display of calculated humility, she completely disarmed him. She told him that she had only dared to argue with him on matters of religion in order to learn from his great wisdom and to provide a pleasant distraction from the pain in his leg. She presented herself as a foolish, simple woman entirely subject to his superior intellect. This was, of course, a performance. Catherine was one of the most intellectually capable women at court, but it was a performance that perfectly played to Henry's colossal ego. He was utterly charmed. He forgave her, and when the Chancellor arrived the next day with guards to take her to the Tower, Henry flew into a rage, calling him a knave and a fool and sending him away. Catherine had not only saved her own life, but she had also broken the power of the conservative faction. Gardiner fell from grace and was, as we know, excluded from the king's will. By outmaneuvering her enemies, Catherine had helped to clear the path for the reformist-dominated Regency Council that would rule after Henry's death. In the king's very final days, her role shifted from political player to compassionate nurse. While the men of the council hovered outside, calculating their next moves, Catherine was likely at his side, offering what comfort she could. Her presence would have provided a sliver of humanity in the highly politicized atmosphere of the royal deathbed. Although she was ushered away before the final moment, her influence lingered. She had provided stability in the king's chaotic final years, she had nurtured the future monarchs, and she had subtly but surely tilted the religious balance of the court in favor of the reformers. Catherine Parr survived Henry, going on to marry her old love, Thomas Seymour, the Lord Protector's ambitious brother, only to die in childbirth a year later. Her time as queen was short, but her impact was profound. She was the quiet, intelligent force that helped guide the Tudor dynasty through its most vulnerable transition, ensuring that when the dying king finally let go, the future would belong to the faith she held so dear. Her role is a quiet secret of the reign, a testament to the power of gentle influence in a world of brute force.
The Regency and the young Edward. The death of a king is always a moment of profound uncertainty. But the death of a king who leaves a child as his heir is a moment of supreme national peril. A boy king cannot rule. He is a symbol, a figurehead, a prize to be controlled by the powerful and ambitious men around him. The careful planning for the regency of 9-year-old Edward VI was Henry VIII's final obsession, his last great attempt to control England from the grave. But the plan he devised and the reality that unfolded were two very different things. The story of the Regency's formation is the story of how a dying king's best-laid plans were swept away by the raw political ambition he himself had nurtured. Henry was no fool. He knew the dangers of a minority rule from English history. The disastrous reign of Richard II and the bloody Wars of the Roses, which were born out of factional struggles during the minority of Henry VI, were cautionary tales deeply ingrained in the Tudor consciousness. His goal was to prevent a repeat of this history. He was determined to avoid concentrating power in the hands of a single regent or Lord Protector, a role that could easily become a stepping stone to the throne itself, as Richard III had so infamously demonstrated. His solution, laid out in his will, was the Council of 16 Executors. This was, on paper, a work of political genius. The council was a carefully balanced mix of men from the new aristocracy, men like Seymour and Dudley, whose fortunes Henry had made, and more established figures. It was designed to be a collective regency with no single leader. Decisions were to be made by majority vote. To further ensure this balance, he named a secondary council of 12 assistants who could be consulted but had no vote. It was a system of checks and balances designed for one purpose: to keep the factions in equilibrium and to preserve his son's inheritance until he came of age. But the plan he devised and the reality that unfolded were two very different things. The will was not technically violated, they claimed, because a clause in it gave the executors the power to grant themselves lands and honors. They simply interpreted this clause in the most generous way possible, using it as a justification to create the very protectorship Henry had sought to avoid. The young Edward VI was the silent, central figure in all of this. He was a pawn in a game he was too young to understand. He was brought from his household at Ashridge to the Tower of London, a fortress that served as both a royal palace and a state prison, a fitting symbol of his gilded cage. He was now king, but he had less freedom than before. He was constantly surrounded by the men of the new regime, his uncle foremost among them. His every word and action were monitored. Edward, however, was not a blank slate. He was a prodigiously intelligent and deeply serious child. His reformist tutors had filled him with a fervent, unshakable Protestant faith. He saw himself as a new Josiah, the biblical boy king who cleansed the temple of its idols. He wrote in his journal about his desire to purge England of all papist dregs. This youthful piety made him a powerful tool for the new government. Seymour and Cranmer didn't have to force a Protestant Reformation on a reluctant king. They simply had to unleash the zeal that was already there.
they could present their radical religious changes as not their own policies, but as the fulfillment of the young king's own godly wishes. The planning for the new reign had been happening long before Henry's death. The reformers had ensured that Edward's education would make him their champion. They had sidelined their conservative rivals. The transition was remarkably smooth, a testament to their careful preparations. The transfer of power was presented to the world as a seamless and unified process. The council, having elevated Seymour, proceeded to vote themselves a lavish set of new titles. Seymour became Duke of Somerset, John Dudley became Earl of Warwick, and Thomas Wriothesley, despite his conservative leanings, was placated with the earldom of Southampton before his eventual fall from grace. The dark secret here is the gap between the public image and the private reality. Publicly, the new government presented itself as the loyal and obedient executor of the late king's will. They held a magnificent funeral for Henry and a glorious coronation for Edward. They spoke constantly of their duty to uphold the legacy of their great sovereign. But privately, they had staged a quiet coup. They had set aside the central principle of Henry's political testament and concentrated power in the hands of one man, backed by a single faction. Henry's great plan for a stable, balanced regency had failed before his body was even cold. He had intended to rule from the grave, but his legacy was immediately captured and reshaped by the very men he had empowered. The future of England would be decided not by the dead hand of Henry VIII, but by the living ambitions of the Duke of Somerset and the fervent piety of a lonely 9-year-old boy who was now, in name at least, the King of England.
The impact on England's religion. The death of Henry VIII was a seismic event for the English Church. For more than a decade, the religious identity of the nation had been held in a state of suspended animation, shaped entirely by the personal theology and political needs of its king. Henry had created a strange and unique creature, a church that was Catholic in its heart, but wore a Protestant head. It had bishops, priests, and the Latin Mass. It affirmed transubstantiation and confession, but it denied the authority of the Pope. It was a church built on a contradiction, held together only by the force of Henry's will. When that will was extinguished, the contradiction could no longer hold. His death did not just change the monarch, it broke the dam, unleashing the torrent of religious change that he had, in his final years, tried so hard to hold back. To understand the impact, we must remember the religious atmosphere of 1546. Henry's middle way was a path of terror. You could be burned as a heretic for being too Protestant, like Anne Askew, who was tortured and executed for denying transubstantiation, or you could be hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor for being too Catholic, like those who continued to assert papal authority. The king enforced his unique brand of theology with brutal force. The Act of 6 Articles, the bloody whip with 6 strings, was the law of the land, viciously punishing any deviation from conservative Catholic doctrine. Yet at the same time, the English Bible was in every parish, and reformist ideas, carried on the air from Germany and Switzerland, were spreading inexorably. The country was in a state of profound religious tension. Henry's death instantly changed the balance of power. The conservative faction, which had championed the 6 Articles and sought to stamp out Protestantism, was suddenly leaderless and broken. Their main patrons, the Duke of Norfolk and his son, were imprisoned or executed. Their key intellectual, Bishop Gardiner, was excluded from power. The new regime, under the Lord Protector Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, was dominated by men with sincere and deep-seated Protestant convictions. For them, Henry's Reformation had not gone nearly far enough. It was a political break, not a true spiritual one. Now was their chance to create a truly reformed, evangelical Church of England. The changes came with breathtaking speed. One of the first acts of the new government was to repeal the Act of 6 Articles. The whip with 6 strings was broken. They also repealed the old heresy laws. Suddenly, it was no longer a capital crime to hold Protestant beliefs. This opened the floodgates.
Radical preachers, many of whom had been in exile on the continent, flocked back to England. London in particular became a hotbed of fiery sermons denouncing the Mass, religious images, and prayers for the dead. The visual landscape of English religion began to change dramatically. Under Somerset's protectorate, the government issued injunctions ordering the removal of all images from churches. This went far beyond Henry's limited campaign against shrines. Now, stained glass windows were smashed, statues were pulled down and burned, and ancient frescoes were whitewashed over. Centuries of religious art were destroyed in a wave of officially sanctioned iconoclasm. This was a profound shock to ordinary people, for whom these images were a familiar and beloved part of their spiritual world. The church, once a colorful, sensory space, was becoming a plain, whitewashed auditorium, a place for listening to the Word, not for venerating saints. The doctrinal heart of the old faith, the Mass, was the next target. Archbishop Cranmer, finally free from the constraints of his conservative master, could now implement the liturgical reforms he had long dreamed of. In 1549, he introduced the first Book of Common Prayer. This was a revolutionary document. It replaced the Latin Mass with a communion service entirely in English. While it was cleverly worded to be acceptable to some conservatives, its theological direction was unmistakably Protestant. The sacrificial nature of the Mass was downplayed, and the service was reoriented around the congregation's participation and understanding. This first prayer book, however, was just a stepping stone. As the young King Edward grew older and his own radical Protestantism became more pronounced, and as more extreme reformers like John Knox gained influence at court, the pressure grew to push the Reformation even further. The brief and disastrous rule of Somerset was followed by the even more radical Duke of Northumberland. In 1552, a second, far more Protestant Book of Common Prayer was introduced. This version removed all ambiguity. It stripped the communion service of any lingering Catholic ceremony, referring to it as a memorial, not a sacrifice. The stone altars in the churches were ordered to be removed and replaced with simple wooden tables. By the time of Edward's death in 1553, the Church of England was Protestant in a way that would have been unrecognizable and horrifying to his father. Henry's death, therefore, was the single most important catalyst for the English Reformation's second, more radical phase. He had started a fire he thought he could control, but the moment he was gone, his successors fanned it into a conflagration. The dark secret from Henry's perspective would be this ultimate trail of his religious vision. He had wanted to be the supreme head of an English Catholic church. Instead, his death paved the way for that church to be dismantled and rebuilt on a Swiss Protestant model. The future he had fought so hard to secure for his son became a future he himself would have condemned as heresy. His legacy was not preserved. It was utterly transformed.
The funeral and public mourning. The death of a king who has reigned for nearly 4 decades is more than the end of a life. It is the end of an era. The funeral of Henry VIII was not just a ceremony for a deceased monarch. It was a vast and magnificent piece of political theater, designed to awe the public, legitimize the new regime, and cement the legacy of the Tudor dynasty. It was the final extravagant act in the performative drama of Henry's kingship, a spectacle of mourning that was as grand and contradictory as the man himself. After Henry's death was finally announced on January 31st, 1547, his body, which had been embalmed with spices and encased in a lead coffin, lay in state in the chapel at Whitehall Palace. For days, the public was allowed to file past, to gaze upon the magnificent hearse, a vast candle-lit catafalque draped in rich fabrics and heraldic banners. This was a carefully managed display. The public did not see the decaying, ulcerated body, but a powerful symbol of monarchy, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and power.
Masses were said for his soul around the clock, a deeply traditional Catholic practice that stood in stark contrast to the Protestant future the new regime was already planning. This was the first of many contradictions. The funeral was an exercise in looking backwards, honoring the old ways, even as the government was preparing to leap forward. The centerpiece of the mourning was the funeral procession. On February 14th, the king's coffin began its slow, 2-day journey from London to its final resting place at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. The scale of the procession was breathtaking. It was over 4 miles long, a river of black-clad mourners flowing through the winter landscape. At its head rode the knights and officials of the royal household, followed by hundreds of gentlemen, bishops, and ambassadors. The coffin itself was carried on a gigantic chariot pulled by 8 black-draped horses. On top of the coffin lay a life-size wax effigy of the king, dressed in crimson velvet and ermine, wearing a crown and holding the orb and scepter. This effigy was startlingly realistic. It was Henry as he wished to be remembered, majestic, powerful, and serene, not the bloated, pain-racked man of his final years. It was a carefully constructed lie, the first step in the creation of the Henry myth. As the procession snaked its way through the streets of London and out into the countryside, thousands of ordinary people lined the route. What did they feel? The official chronicles speak of widespread, genuine grief, of people weeping for the loss of their great king. There was surely some truth to this. For anyone under the age of 45, Henry was the only king they had ever known. He was a figure of immense, almost supernatural authority, a symbol of England itself. His death would have been a profoundly unsettling event, a disturbance in the natural order of things. For all his tyranny, he had also brought a degree of internal stability after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. He was their king, and his passing marked the end of their world as they knew it. But the mourning was also performative and mandated. Every parish church along the route was ordered to ring its bells. Every householder was expected to show a sign of grief. In an autocratic state, public mourning is not always a spontaneous outpouring of emotion. It is also an act of political compliance. There would have been many, the secret Catholics who hated his break with Rome, the families of those he had executed, the poor who suffered under his economic policies, who felt little but relief. But they would not have dared to show it. The public face of England was one of universal sorrow. The procession rested overnight at Sion Abbey, a former monastery that Henry himself had dissolved. It is here that a strange and macabre incident is said to have occurred, an event that became part of the dark secret of his end. The chronicler John Stowe, writing decades later, recorded a story that during the night the lead coffin, which had perhaps been damaged by the jolting of the journey, burst open. Blood and bodily fluids leaked out onto the floor. In the morning, servants discovered dogs licking up the king's remains from the paving stones. This gruesome tale was seen by Catholic polemicists as divine judgment, the fulfillment of a prophecy made by a Franciscan friar who had condemned Henry's actions and predicted that dogs would lick his blood. While the story may be an exaggeration or a piece of anti-Henry propaganda, it speaks to a hidden truth. Beneath the magnificent pageantry, there was the raw, undignified reality of physical decay. The pomp of the funeral was an attempt to cover up the grotesque fact of death, but reality, as it often does, had a way of seeping through. On February 16th, the coffin arrived at Windsor. The final ceremony in St. George's Chapel was a masterpiece of liturgical grandeur. It was a full requiem mass, sung in Latin, with all the Catholic ritual that the new regime was about to abolish. Henry was laid to rest in a vault in the middle of the choir, next to his third and favorite wife, Jane Seymour, the mother of his heir. He had intended to be buried under a colossal and magnificent tomb, a project he had begun planning years before,
but it was never finished. The new government had little interest in spending a fortune on a monument to the old king. They had their own ambitions to fund. So, the greatest king of the Tudor dynasty was buried in a shared vault, marked only by a simple slab. The grand tomb, like his plan for a balanced regency, remained an unfulfilled dream. The funeral was over, the king was buried, and the nation turned to face the uncertain dawn of a new age. The myth-making, however, was just begun.
The Black Legend of Henry VIII. Once a great figure dies, their life story ceases to belong to them. It becomes public property, a lump of clay to be molded and reshaped by future generations, each with its own agenda, its own biases, and its own need for heroes and villains. For Henry VIII, the process of myth-making began the moment he died, but it was his afterlife in the pages of history that truly forged the complex and often monstrous image we know today. The creation of the Black Legend of Henry VIII is a story of how a complex man was flattened into a caricature of a bloodthirsty, gluttonous, wife-killing tyrant. The first drafts of Henry's historical reputation were written by those who had lived through his reign, and they were, not surprisingly, deeply partisan. For the Protestant reformers who flourished under his son Edward, Henry was a complicated figure. On the one hand, he was the instrument of God's will, the English Moses, who had led them out of the bondage of the Pope. John Foxe, in his hugely influential Acts and Monuments, better known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, presented Henry as a heroic, if flawed figure who had courageously broken with Rome. Foxe and other Protestant writers downplayed his doctrinal conservatism and his persecution of their own fellow reformers, choosing instead to focus on his anti-papal stance. For them, his sins were forgivable because he had served a greater providential purpose. On the other side were the Catholic writers, many of them exiled on the continent during the reigns of Edward and later Elizabeth. For them, Henry was nothing less than a schismatic, a heretic, a monster who had destroyed the ancient faith of England for the sake of his lust and ambition. Writers like Nicholas Sander and Reginald Pole, a cardinal and a cousin of the king, painted a picture of a depraved tyrant. They were the ones who sensationalized his private life, portraying him as a sexual predator. Sander, for example, floated the scandalous and entirely baseless rumor that Henry was Anne Boleyn's biological father. They highlighted his cruelty, his execution of saints like Thomas More and John Fisher, and his sacrilegious destruction of the monasteries. It is in their works that we find the first, most lurid brushstrokes of the Black Legend. They depicted his physical decay in his final years not as a medical condition, but as a divine punishment, a visible sign of his inner corruption. The story of the dogs licking his blood at Sion Abbey was a cornerstone of this narrative. For much of the next several centuries, which version of Henry you encountered depended on the religious leanings of the historian you read. But as the religious wars of the 16th century faded, a more secular and sensationalized image began to emerge. The focus shifted from his theology to his wives. The rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, a much later invention, perfectly encapsulated this new focus. He became the ultimate marital monster, a Bluebeard in a crown. His complex political and religious motivations were simplified into a narrative of personal appetite for food, for women, and for power. The image of the corpulent, turkey leg-wielding glutton, while having a basis in the reality of his later years, became his defining characteristic, overshadowing the athletic, intellectual prince of his youth. The Victorian era, with its strict moral codes, found Henry particularly fascinating and repellent. Historians like James Anthony Froude tried to rehabilitate him, presenting him as a strong, nation-building monarch who had to make difficult choices for the good of England. But the popular imagination was more captivated by the image of the tyrant. He was the embodiment of unchecked power and masculine appetite, a figure both terrifying and titillating to the buttoned-up sensibilities of the 19th century. In the 20th century, the rise of popular history and media cemented the Black legend. The famous 1933 film The Private Life of Henry VIII, starring Charles Laughton, created the enduring image of the boorish, food-flinging, larger-than-life monarch. Laughton's brilliant, Oscar-winning performance defined Henry for generations of moviegoers, but it was a caricature, emphasizing his gluttony and lust above all else. This image has proven remarkably resilient, echoed in countless documentaries, television series, and popular novels. The dark secret that the Black legend tells is not about Henry himself, but about our historical memory. It reveals our tendency to simplify complex figures into easily digestible archetypes. It's easier to remember the wife killer than the shrewd theologian, the glutton than the skilled musician and patron of the arts. The Black legend obscures the real man in all his contradictions. It forgets the genuine charisma of his youth, the intellectual depth that impressed the scholars of Europe, and the sincere, if tormented, nature of his religious beliefs. It also flattens the women around him, turning his wives into a simple list of victims rather than the complex political and religious agents they often were. The Henry of the Black legend is a monster, and while the real Henry was certainly capable of monstrous acts, he was also more and less than that. He was a man trapped by the expectations of kingship, by his own insecurities, and ultimately by his own decaying body. The legend provides a satisfyingly simple villain for the drama of the English Reformation. The quiet, reflective truth is that the history was far messier and the man at its center far more complicated than the legend allows.
Historians' silence and speculation. History is a conversation between the present and the past, but it is a conversation in which some voices are much louder than others. The story of Henry VIII's death has been dominated by the loud official voices of the state and the sensational shouts of polemicists. But what of the silences? What of the details that historians, for centuries, chose to ignore or whisper about only in footnotes? The silence of historians is not always an absence of knowledge. Often, it is a conscious or unconscious choice, a decision to turn away from truths that are uncomfortable, undignified, or that do not fit the preferred narrative. For a very long time, the dominant school of history writing focused on great men and their great deeds. This was political and constitutional history. It was concerned with acts of parliament, foreign treaties, and the high politics of the court. In this framework, the physical body of the king was largely irrelevant, except as it pertained to his ability to rule or produce an heir. The grim, visceral details of Henry's final illness, the smell of his ulcers, the daily agony, the indignity of his immobility, were considered unseemly and unimportant. They were domestic details, not the proper stuff of serious history. To dwell on them was seen as prurient and disrespectful to the majesty of the monarch. This silence was a product of historical decorum. It was a choice to preserve the dignity of the office, even if it meant obscuring the reality of the man. This reticence was particularly strong when it came to the more scandalous speculations, like the theory of syphilis. For Victorian and early 20th century historians, this was a topic to be avoided at all costs. It was sexually explicit, morally compromising, and deeply un-English. To suggest that the founder of the nation's church, the father of the great Queen Elizabeth I, had died of a venereal disease was an attack on the national character. It was far more respectable to stick to the official causes of death. This silence wasn't about a lack of evidence. The rumors had existed since the 16th century, but about a set of cultural taboos.
The theory was relegated to the fringes, a piece of scandalous gossip, rather than a serious medical hypothesis. Another area of relative silence has been the full extent of the political manipulation surrounding the king's will. The official narrative, established by the victors, was that of a smooth and planned transition. The coup by Seymour was presented as a necessary adjustment for the sake of good governance. For a long time, historians were content to repeat this narrative, to question it too deeply, to portray the founders of the English Protestant state as cynical, ambitious plotters who manipulated a dying man, was to challenge a foundational myth. It was easier to accept the story that Henry had a last-minute change of heart about Gardiner and the Howards than to confront the likelihood that he was a pawn in a game he no longer controlled. This silence served a teleological view of history, the idea that events unfolded as they were meant to do, leading inevitably to the triumph of Protestantism and the Elizabethan Golden Age. It was only in the later 20th century, with the rise of new historical approaches, that these silences began to be broken. The history from below movement encouraged historians to look at the lives of ordinary people, but it also fostered an interest in aspects of elite life that had been ignored, like health, medicine, and the body. The field of medical history brought new analytical tools to the question of Henry's ailments, moving beyond simple narrative and into a world of diagnostic possibility. Social and cultural historians became interested in the dark secrets, precisely because they revealed so much about the anxieties and beliefs of the Tudor age. This is when the speculation truly began to flourish, filling the spaces that the silence had left. Historians began to ask the questions that had been deemed inappropriate. What was the lived experience of being Henry VIII in 1546? How did his pain shape his policy? They re-examined the syphilis theory, not as a moral judgment, but as a medical possibility to be weighed against the evidence. They looked again at the downfall of the Howards and the creation of the Protectorate, recasting it as a ruthless and brilliantly executed power grab. The work of scholars like Eric Ives, David Starkley, and G.W. Bernard began to paint a far more complex and nuanced picture of the king's final years, one that was not afraid to confront the physical grotesquerie and the political cynicism. The silence of past historians, therefore, is a story in itself. It shows how history is shaped by the values of its time. The things we choose not to talk about are often as revealing as the things we proclaim. The dark secret of Henry's death was hidden in plain sight for centuries, obscured by a veil of decorum and narrative convenience. The modern willingness to speculate, to probe the uncomfortable and the unknown, is what allows us to have a calmer, more reflective, and perhaps more human understanding of the king's end. We are no longer just looking at the monument. We are daring to peek into the vault, to confront the messy reality of the man within.
The King's Skeleton and Modern Forensics. In the quiet pursuit of historical truth, there is no greater prize than a tangible link to the past, a physical remnant that can be subjected to the unbiased scrutiny of modern science. For historians of Henry VIII, the ultimate key to unlocking the medical mysteries of his death lies just a few feet beneath the stone floor of St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The King's Skeleton. For centuries, his remains have rested beside those of Jane Seymour, a silent repository of biological evidence. The tantalizing question is, what could modern forensics tell us if we were able to examine them? And what has been revealed by the rare occasions when the vault has been disturbed? The tomb of Henry VIII is not a grand, visible sarcophagus. It is a subterranean vault in the center of the chapel's choir. After his burial in 1447, it was sealed and largely forgotten, marked only by a simple stone slab. The magnificent tomb he had planned was never built. The vault was not opened again for nearly 170 years. Then, in 1813, during construction work for a new royal burial vault nearby,
workmen accidentally broke through the wall of Henry's tomb. The Prince Regent, the future King George IV, was informed, and, driven by historical curiosity, he ordered the vault to be properly opened and its contents examined. The scene that greeted the small group of officials and physicians who descended into the chamber was one of somber decay. They found a large lead coffin, identified as Henry's, and a smaller one, Jane Seymour's. Also in the vault was the coffin of an infant child of Queen Anne, and, most surprisingly, the coffin of King Charles I, who had been executed in 1649 and buried secretly in the same location. The antiquarians of 1813 were primarily interested in identifying Charles I, but they did take the opportunity to make a small opening in Henry's coffin. What they saw was a stunning confirmation of the historical record. Inside the lead shell was a plain wooden coffin which had collapsed. Within the wreckage, they could see the king's skeleton. It was, they reported, lying in a bed of what appeared to be dried, resinous material from the embalming process. Crucially, they noted that the skeleton was that of an immense man. The bones were large and powerful, confirming his robust frame. They measured the skeleton and estimated its height at 6 feet 2 inches, which corresponds well with contemporary descriptions. This 1813 account, though brief, is our only direct eyewitness description of the king's remains. The physicians present did not have the tools or the knowledge to conduct a forensic analysis. They were antiquarians, not pathologists. They looked, they recorded, and then they sealed the vault once more. It has not been opened since. The silence of the tomb resumed. But let us engage in a quiet, reflective speculation. What if, today, with the permission of the current monarch, a team of forensic scientists were allowed to briefly and respectfully examine those remains? The secrets they could unlock would be extraordinary. First, DNA analysis. A sample of bone or tooth could definitively answer some of the most persistent questions. The theory of Macleod syndrome linked to the Kell blood group could be tested. We could finally know if this rare genetic disorder was the underlying cause of his physical, mental, and reproductive problems. A DNA profile would also allow for a definitive mapping of the Tudor family tree, confirming relationships and potentially identifying genetic markers for other inherited conditions. Second, forensic anthropology and paleopathology could analyze the bones themselves. The skeleton would be a roadmap of his life. Healed fractures from his jousting career would be visible. The state of his joints would provide clear evidence of arthritis, likely the debilitating gout that plagued him. Most importantly, a close examination of his leg bones, particularly the tibias, could provide the smoking gun for the osteomyelitis. The bone itself would likely show signs of chronic infection, pitting, deformation, and reactive new bone growth. This would move the diagnosis from a strong probability to a near certainty. The bones could also offer clues about the syphilis debate. While the disease itself would not be present, advanced tertiary syphilis can leave characteristic marks on the skeleton, particularly on the skull and shin bones. The absence of these specific lesions would be a powerful argument against the syphilis theory. Furthermore, chemical analysis of the bone tissue could reveal much about his life and death. Isotope analysis could give a precise picture of his diet, confirming his massive consumption of meat and protein. More tantalizingly, trace element analysis could search for evidence of heavy metal poisoning. We could finally know if his physician's remedies, the lead and mercury ointments, were slowly poisoning him. High levels of these metals embedded in his bones would be a dark testament to the well-intentioned but lethal medicine of his time. Of course, the opening of a royal tomb is a matter of great sensitivity. The resting place of a monarch is not a laboratory specimen. It is a grave, and it commands respect. It is highly unlikely that such an examination will happen anytime soon.
And so the king's skeleton remains a source of speculation, a silent witness whose testimony we cannot hear. The secrets of his body are, for now, safe with him in the quiet dark beneath the stones of Windsor. But modern science allows us to dream, to imagine what we could know, and to understand that the final, irrefutable truths of Henry's decline are not lost to history, but merely locked away, waiting for a key that may never be turned.
Henry VIII in popular culture. The long, slow fade of a historical figure into the quiet of the past is not always their final chapter. Some are resurrected, reborn again and again in the vibrant, ever-changing world of popular culture. Of all the English monarchs, perhaps only his daughter Elizabeth has had as vivid and enduring an afterlife as Henry VIII. From the stages of Shakespeare's London to the glossy, high-definition dramas of the streaming era, his life, and in particular his dramatic decline and death, have been a source of endless fascination. How his end is portrayed tells us as much about the age creating the story as it does about the king himself. The first and most significant dramatic portrayal of Henry came from a man who may have seen him in the flesh as a child, William Shakespeare. In his play Henry VIII, a work likely co-authored with John Fletcher, we see the king not in his final decay, but in the midst of his great matter, the divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his marriage to Anne Boleyn. The play ends on a note of triumph with the birth of Elizabeth and a prophecy of her glorious reign. There is no hint of the tyrant to come, no foreshadowing of the ulcers and the paranoia. This was a play written for a Jacobean audience, celebrating the Protestant succession and the mother of the recent, beloved Queen Elizabeth. It was a patriotic theater, a foundational myth for the Tudor-Stuart dynasty. It gives us Henry the nation builder, not Henry the monster. For centuries after, Henry remained a figure of the stage, but it was in the 20th century, with the birth of cinema, that his image became globally iconic. The definitive portrayal, as we have noted, was Charles Laughton's in The Private Life of Henry VIII, 1933. This film almost single-handedly created the modern, popular image of the king. It is a masterpiece of character acting, but it is not a work of history. Laughton's Henry is a boisterous, comical, food-throwing bully. His marriages are a source of black comedy. His death is not shown, but his aging and gluttony are central to the performance. The film focuses almost exclusively on his relationships with his wives, reducing the complex political and religious turmoil of the reign to a series of bedroom farces. This is the origin of the turkey leg Henry, a caricature so powerful it is proven almost impossible to erase. The mid-20th century saw more serious and historically grounded portrayals. Robert Shaw's performance in the film A Man for All Seasons, 1966, is a brilliant counterpoint to Laughton. Shaw gives us the Henry of his prime, charismatic, intelligent, athletic, but with a chilling undercurrent of menace. He is a man who is used to getting his way, and his friendship with Thomas More is genuine, which makes his eventual turn against him all the more terrifying. The film powerfully captures the intellectual and moral crisis of the reign, showing how a man of conscience cannot survive in the orbit of such absolute power. Television, with its capacity for long-form storytelling, has offered the most recent and perhaps most nuanced explorations of Henry's decline. The 2003 British series, Henry VIII, starring Ray Winstone, made a conscious effort to depict the two sides of the king, the vigorous youth and the ailing tyrant. Winstone captured the rage and the pain of the later years, his performance visceral and intimidating. But it was the Showtime series, The Tudors, 2007 to 2010, that brought Henry's story to a new generation. The show was famous and infamous for its glamour, its historical inaccuracies, and its focus on the sexual and political intrigue of the court. Jonathan Rhys Meyers, an actor far too handsome and slender to portray the real Henry, was cast in the lead role for all 4 seasons. This was a controversial choice, but it served a thematic purpose. The showrunners wanted to explore the man inside the monster. In the final season, which covers Henry's last years, the show finally grappled with his physical decline. Rhys was padded and given extensive makeup to suggest the bloating and sickness. The leg ulcers became a recurring graphic motif. The show depicted his pain, his paranoia, and his haunted sleepless nights where he is visited by the ghosts of his executed wives. His death scene is quiet and moving, focusing on his loneliness and his whispered memories of the past. While the Tudors took many liberties with the facts, it was one of the first mainstream productions to spend significant time exploring the psychological and physical torment of the king's end, attempting to show the suffering man beneath the crown. The dark secret that these portrayals reveal is our enduring need to humanize our monsters. We are not content with a simple caricature of a tyrant. We want to understand his motivations, to see his vulnerabilities, to witness his suffering. Each generation recreates Henry in its own image. For Shakespeare, he was a founding father. For Lawton, a comical rogue. For Robert Shaw, a charming predator. For the modern television audience, he is a complex, tormented anti-hero. His death in these stories is the final reckoning, the moment when the bill for his life of excess, both political and personal, finally comes due. His cultural afterlife is a testament to the fact that some figures are too large, too contradictory, and too fascinating to ever truly die. They simply wait in the wings for their next curtain call.
The man behind the myth. Let us now, in the quiet of this reflection, attempt to pull back the heavy velvet curtain of myth and caricature. Let us try to find the man. Beyond the black legend, beyond the sanitized official histories, beyond the ghosts of his wives and the echoes of his rages, there was a human being named Henry Tudor who lived and, in the winter of 1547, died. To understand him in his final days is an exercise in empathy, a journey into the heart of a profound and lonely suffering. Let us imagine for a moment the world from his perspective. Picture the great four-poster bed, the air in the chamber close and warm, thick with the smell of wood smoke and sickness. The world outside the window is gray and cold, the January light thin and weak. But the world inside, for Henry, is one of pain. It is the first thing he feels upon waking and the last thing he knows before drifting into a fitful, fevered sleep. It is not a noble, temporary pain of a battle wound, but a dull, chronic, humiliating agony. It is in his leg, a constant, foul throb. It is in his joints, the fiery needles of gout. It is in his chest, the strain of drawing breath into a body that has become its own immense burden. This constant pain is the key. It is the lens through which he sees the world. It shortens his temper, clouds his judgment, and feeds his deepest insecurities. He who was once the master of his physical domain, a celebrated sportsman and dancer, is now utterly dependent. He cannot rise from his bed without help. He cannot walk across a room without assistance. He cannot even relieve himself with dignity. This humiliation, for a man with an ego as vast as his kingdom, must have been a form of daily, grinding torture. The rage he was so famous for was not just the arrogance of a king, but the desperate, helpless fury of a prisoner. And he was a prisoner of his past. In the long, sleepless nights, what did he think about? The portrayals of him being haunted by the ghosts of his wives are dramatic fiction, but the psychological truth is sound. He must have been haunted. Haunted by Catherine of Aragon, his loyal wife of 2 decades, cast aside and left to die in isolation. Haunted by Anne of Boleyn, the woman for whom he broke the world, whose bright, sharp mind he had loved and then ordered extinguished. Haunted by Thomas More, his friend and intellectual companion, whom he sent to the block for a matter of conscience.
He had built his new world on a foundation of broken vows and shed blood. Did he, in the quiet of the end, feel the weight of those choices? His will, with its desperate Catholic-style plea for perpetual masses to be said for his soul, suggests a man deeply anxious about his final judgment. He was the supreme head of the church, but he was also a man who feared he might be damned. Then there was the loneliness. Absolute power is a fortress, and its walls are high. He was surrounded by people, servants, physicians, counselors, a queen. But was he ever truly known? Every word spoken to him was calculated. Every opinion was tailored to his known prejudices. He was fed a constant diet of flattery and fear. He craved loyalty, but his own actions had made genuine loyalty impossible. He rewarded ambition, and so he was surrounded by the ambitious. He punished dissent, and so he was surrounded by sycophants. He could not be sure if the care that he received from his wife, Catherine Parr, was born of genuine affection or terrified duty. He could not trust the advice of his council. In the end, he was utterly, terribly alone, the most powerful man in England, and perhaps the most isolated. So, let us set aside the image of the roaring, turkey leg waving tyrant for a moment. Let us instead picture an old, sick man sitting in a cushioned chair, wrapped in furs against the chill that his fever cannot seem to burn away. He stares into the fire. His heavy-lidded eyes see not just the flames, but a procession of faces and choices from a life of incredible drama. He is in pain. He is afraid. He is lonely. He is wrestling with the legacy he will leave behind: a child king, a divided nation, a church torn from its roots. This is not to excuse his cruelty or his tyranny. His actions had devastating consequences for thousands of people, but it is to understand that the monster of the myth was also a man who, like all of us, was mortal, vulnerable, and subject to the ravages of time and disease. The dark secret in the end might be this simple humanizing truth, that at the heart of the great historical drama of Henry VIII's death lies the quiet universal tragedy of a man facing his own end, burdened by the weight of his life and terrified of what comes next.
What we can learn from his death. The story of a king's death receding into the mists of the 16th century can feel like a distant and alien tale. It is a world of palaces and plots, of religious doctrines and dynastic struggles that seem to have little bearing on our own lives. And yet, if we listen quietly to the echoes of Henry VIII's final days, we can find timeless and resonant lessons about the nature of power, the relationship between our physical and mental health, and the deceptive silence of history itself. The first and most powerful lesson is about the illusion of control. Henry VIII was a man who dedicated his entire reign to the pursuit of absolute control. He sought to control the succession of his dynasty, the religion of his people, the loyalty of his court, and even the conscience of his subjects. He built a fearsome apparatus of state power to enforce his will. And yet, in the end, he was powerless against the most fundamental forces of existence. He could not control the decay of his own body. He could not command his wounds to heal or his pain to cease. His final days are a stark reminder that no amount of worldly power can grant immunity from the universal human conditions of sickness, aging, and mortality. And even his political control was an illusion. His most carefully laid plan, the detailed will designed to govern England from his grave, was cast aside before his funeral was even over. The very men he had empowered used the skills he taught them to subvert his wishes for their own gain. It teaches us that power is a transient and fickle thing. It cannot be hoarded or held forever. The legacy one tries so desperately to forge will ultimately be reinterpreted and reshaped by those who come after. True influence is not about control, but about the ideas and institutions one leaves behind, and even those are subject to the ceaseless current of change. The second lesson is a profound and deeply modern one about the indivisible link between our physical and mental health. In our own time, we are only just beginning to fully appreciate how deeply our minds and bodies are connected. Henry's story is a dramatic, large-scale illustration of this principle. We see how chronic physical pain, from his ulcers, his gout, his obesity, manifested as psychological distress. His agony became his rage. His physical vulnerability became his paranoia. His deteriorating body led to a deteriorating temperament, with catastrophic consequences for those around him and for the governance of his kingdom. It is a powerful cautionary tale about what happens when pain is left unmanaged and the body is neglected. While Henry's diet was a symbol of his status, it was also a slow-acting poison. His story prompts us to reflect on our own relationships with health and well-being. It reminds us that caring for our physical selves is not an indulgence, but a prerequisite for mental clarity, emotional stability, and our ability to interact with the world in a constructive way. The tyrant in the palace was first a man in pain. Finally, Henry's death teaches us to listen for the silences in history. The official story of his end was a neat and tidy narrative of a pious king dying in faith, leaving a stable kingdom. This was the story that served the powerful. The truth, as we have seen, was far messier, more chaotic, and more human. It was a story of physical grotesquerie, political cynicism, and profound suffering. This truth was not recorded in the grand chronicles, but it was there, hidden in the margins, in the coded letters of ambassadors, in the private journals, and in the gossip of the court. It teaches us to be critical consumers of any official narrative. It encourages us to ask, who is telling this story, and what are their motivations? What are they choosing to include, and more importantly, what are they choosing to leave out? The dark secrets of history are not always conspiracies. Often they are simply the uncomfortable truths that have been deliberately or unconsciously smoothed over for the sake of a simpler and more heroic tale. Learning from Henry's death means learning to appreciate the complexity, the contradictions, and the untidy humanity that lie beneath the polished surface of the historical record.
The secrets that remain. Our journey through the shadowed corridors of Henry VIII's final days has illuminated many hidden corners. We have looked beyond the official histories, listened to the whispers of the court, and explored the medical and political realities of his decline. And yet, for all that we have uncovered, we must end in a place of humility, acknowledging the secrets that remain, the questions that linger in the air like dust motes in the winter light of Whitehall Palace. History is not a puzzle with a single final solution, but a landscape of shifting perspectives, and some parts of that landscape will forever remain in shadow. The greatest unanswered question, the one that lies at the very heart of the medical mystery, is the precise nature of his underlying condition. We have theories: McLeod syndrome, Cushing syndrome, the lingering effects of a brain injury, the slow burn of heavy metal poisoning, and they are all compelling in their own way. But without the ability to examine his remains with the tools of modern science, they will forever remain just that, theories. We can argue and speculate, but we cannot know for certain. The king's skeleton holds the definitive answer, but it is a secret the tomb is unlikely to ever give up. Was there a single unifying diagnosis for his catalog of woes? Or was he simply the victim of a perfect storm of more common elements? The silence from the vault at Windsor is absolute. Then there is the secret of the king's own mind, a place no forensic science could ever penetrate. What did he truly believe at the end? His religious settlement was a work of profound contradiction. He died while the rites of his church were still overwhelmingly Catholic, and his will made provision for his soul in a very traditional way. Yet his final recorded act was to summon the reformist Archbishop Cranmer and to give him his hand. Was this a final, definitive tilt towards Protestantism, as the reformers claimed? Or was it simply the act of a dying man reaching for the hand of a trusted friend, a man known for his gentle and comforting presence? Did he see himself as a new Constantine, founding a new church for his nation? Or did he die in fear, a man who knew he had broken with the faith of his ancestors and was terrified of the divine consequences? We can analyze his actions and his writings, but we can never truly know the state of his soul. His ultimate faith remains a secret between him and his God. The precise events surrounding the finalization of his will also hold a tantalizing mystery. We know the outcome. The reformers triumphed, and Seymour became protector. We know that the dry stamp was used. But what was the king's level of consciousness and consent during this crucial period? The accounts are partisan and self-serving. Was Henry actively, lucidly directing these final, momentous changes, clearing the way for a Protestant future he desired? Or was he a semi-conscious, delirious man easily manipulated by the suggestions of those who controlled access to his chamber? Did Sir Anthony Denny, in applying the stamp, believe he was carrying out the king's true wishes? Or was it a conscious act of political forgery for the greater good of the Reformed religion? The truth of that moment, the difference between loyal service and a quiet coup, is a secret that died with the men in that room. And what of Catherine Parr? We know she survived the plot against her through her quick wits and shrewd understanding of her husband's psychology. But what was the true nature of their relationship at the end? Was it one of genuine companionable affection, as some sources suggest? Or was it a relationship built on her terror and his dependence? Did she feel pity, love, or revulsion as she nursed his decaying body? Her public persona was one of a loyal, submissive wife. Her private feelings, her thoughts as she sat by his bed day after day, are a secret she took with her to her own early grave. These remaining secrets are not a failure of history. They're a reminder of its limits. The past does not give up all its truths. There are rooms we cannot enter, thoughts we cannot know, conversations we cannot hear. And perhaps this is as it should be. It allows these figures to retain their essential mystery, to remain subjects of our fascination and our reflection. The story of Henry VIII's death is not a closed case. It is an ongoing conversation, and the secrets that remain are what keep us listening, searching, and wondering, even centuries later.
How history remembers the forgotten. In the grand, sweeping drama of a king's life and death, the spotlight is inevitably drawn to the central players, the monarch himself, his queens, his powerful ministers, his rival lords. Their names echo down the centuries. But the stage of history is a crowded one, and for every figure illuminated by the spotlight, there are countless others standing in the shadows, their voices unheard, their stories lost.
As we reflect on Henry's end, let us take a moment to remember the forgotten, the silent majority whose lives were the backdrop against which this royal tragedy unfolded. Think first of the servants, not the high-ranking gentlemen of the Privy Chamber like Sir Anthony Denny, whose names are recorded, but the anonymous grooms, pages, and laundresses who managed the grim reality of the king's illness. Who were the men who operated the machinery that lifted the 400-pound king from floor to floor? Who were the women who had to wash the soiled linens and bandages, contending daily with the smell of sickness and the king's fearsome temper? Their work was intimate, essential, and often repulsive. They saw the king not as a majestic symbol of power, but as a helpless, suffering patient. They knew the unvarnished, undignified truth of his decline. Yet history does not record their names, their fears, or their thoughts. They are a ghostly presence, their labor everywhere, their identities nowhere. Consider the physicians. We know the names of a few, like Dr. Butts and Dr. Chamber, but what was it like to be the king's doctor in an age before modern medicine? Imagine the immense pressure, the terrifying responsibility. The health of the king was the health of the kingdom, and they was the men charged with preserving it. They were armed with nothing but theories of humors, herbal remedies, and a few brutal surgical techniques. Every day they would face the king, knowing their treatments were likely futile, knowing that any failure could be interpreted as incompetence or even treason. They were trying to fight a forest fire with a water bucket, all under the gaze of a paranoid and pain-maddened patient. Their frustration, their fear, and their sense of professional helplessness are a forgotten emotional landscape of the king's sick room. And what of the ordinary people of England? History remembers the great rebellions like the Pilgrimage of Grace, but it often forgets the quiet, pervasive anxiety that Henry's reign created. Imagine being a simple parishioner in a small village. For your entire life, you have known one faith. You have prayed to the saints, confessed to a priest, and believed in the miracle of the Mass. Then suddenly, from a distant London, a decree arrives. The local monastery is to be closed. The shrine you once visited is destroyed. The priest tells you the Pope is a foreign enemy, and the king is now the head of the church. Then, a few years later, the rules change again. You must believe in things that were once considered heresy. Then, after the king's death, the church is turned upside down. The statues are smashed, the Latin is gone, the services are completely different. The profound spiritual and cultural dislocation felt by millions of ordinary people is a vast, silent story that runs beneath the high politics of the Reformation. Their confusion, their resentment, and their quiet acts of conformity or resistance are the forgotten heart of the era. History also tends to forget the collateral damage. We remember the famous victims of Henry's tyranny, Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, but each of these executions sent out ripples of suffering. What happened to their families, their children, their households? The family of an executed traitor was stripped of its lands and titles, its members disgraced. The children of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were rendered motherless. The hundreds of monks and nuns turned out of their monasteries during the dissolution were cast adrift, their way of life destroyed. These are the forgotten victims, their personal tragedies footnotes to the main story. To remember these forgotten figures is not to diminish the central story of the king, but to enrich it. It is to understand that history is not just a procession of famous names, but a complex ecosystem of human lives, all interconnected. It reminds us that the decisions made in the gilded chambers of Whitehall had real, profound consequences for people at every level of society.
by pausing to think of the servant changing the king's bandages, the physician mixing a useless poultice, or the villager staring at a whitewashed space on a church wall where a beloved saint once stood, we get closer to a truer, more complete, and more human understanding of the past. They are the silent chorus to the royal drama, and their forgotten stories are the quiet soil in which the great events of history are rooted.
Closing thoughts, a king's last breath. And so our long, quiet journey comes to an end. We have walked the shadowy corridors of Whitehall, stood watch in the king's sick room, and listened to the whispers of a court on the edge of a new world. We have sought the man behind the myth and listened for the voices that history has forgotten. Now there is nothing left but the final, simple act itself, a king's last breath. Let us return one last time to that hushed chamber in the deep of a January night. The great fire has burned down to glowing embers. The candles flicker, casting long, dancing shadows on the tapestries. The political calculations have been made, the will has been stamped, the future has been seized by the ambitious. All the noise of the rain, the clamor of battle, the arguments of theologians, the thud of the executioner's axe has faded away. There is only the stillness of the room and the sound of a man's breathing, shallow and labored, a rhythm that is slowly, inexorably running down. The men around the bed, Cranmer, Denny, the physicians, are no longer counselors or servants. They are simply witnesses, watching the undeniable, universal process of life passing into death. In this moment, the man in the bed is not Henry VIII, King of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, supreme head of the Church of England. He is not the great tyrant or the glorious monarch. He is just a body, a vessel of life that is failing. All his titles, all his power, all his wealth are utterly meaningless. The crown, the scepter, the orb, they are just cold, heavy objects. They cannot buy him another minute, another breath. His last recorded act was a squeeze of a hand, a silent, ambiguous gesture of faith or friendship. And after that, there was only the slow letting go, a final, gentle exhalation, a sigh that perhaps carried the weight of a lifetime of ambition, love, rage, and regret. And then silence, a profound and absolute stillness in the room, the moment when the immense gravitational force that was Henry VIII simply ceased to be. In that silence lies the ultimate lesson. It is a lesson about mortality. It is the great equalizer, the final democratic truth that comes for us all, whether we are a king in a palace or a peasant in a hut. For a brief moment, the world held its breath. A 9-year-old boy was now king. A new era had begun. The future of a nation would be irrevocably altered. But for the man who had caused it all, the struggle was over. The pain was gone. The fears were silenced. The weight of the crown was finally and forever lifted. As we retreat from this story, letting the quiet of the past settle back into its slumber, we carry with us not a definitive answer to a historical puzzle, but a feeling
a sense of the profound complexity of a human life, of the way power and pain can shape a soul, and of the quiet, undeniable dignity of a final breath. The dark secret of Henry VIII's death was never a single hidden fact. It was the raw, undignified, and deeply human truth of his end, a truth that history, in its quest for grand narratives, often chooses to forget. But now you remember, and in that quiet remembrance, the story finds its true and lasting peace. Settle now, and let the silence of the past be your guide into a deep and restful sleep.